Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the MHA What If 2.0, with another fanfiction. This is the first part of What If Deku was declared quirkless but became dangerous? All credits for this video go to their respective authors, so please support the real author. Check out the link in the description for more details. Please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Shoyuta Aizawa, also known as Eraserhead, was a relatively young hero, but he liked to think he was fairly well versed when it came to disasters. Though he was primarily an underground hero, conducting his business in the shadows, Shoyuta was occasionally called in during the day to handle individuals who had lost control of their quirks. His unique ability to temporarily erase them came in especially handy when situations required a more delicate de-escalation. But Shoyuta had never seen anything like this. His throat tightened as he looked at the turmoil surrounding the scene. The world itself seemed to be being ripped apart at the seams. Everything from chunks of pavement to cars parked on the street were wrapped in an unearthly emerald glow and drawn towards the epicenter of the disturbance. Shoyuta could hardly make out the tiny figure, cocooned in a brilliant white light and blazing iridescent flames, floating above the ruined apartment complex. He slipped through the fences, sectioning off the torn-up section of road from the public, and was immediately approached by an older police officer seemingly in charge of the site. "Thank goodness you're here, Eraserhead. What do we know so far?" Shoyuta cut in as the winds picked around them. "Other tenants of the building have identified the kid up there," he said, gesturing in the direction of the blaze, as Izuku Midoriya. He is 7 years old and was thought to be quirkless. He lives in apartment 417 with his parents Inko and Hisashi. Their whereabouts are currently unknown. However, noise complaints from minutes before the disaster placed them in the apartment. Apparently it was quite the volatile household. Shoyuta nodded grimly. "It was one of those cases. We are fortunate that you happen to be nearby. This is usually such a quiet area." He hesitated, glancing downwards. "You're the only pro-hero on the scene. ETA of the nearest agency is at least 10 minutes dash." "We don't have 10 minutes. Shoyuta said flatly. "I'll just take care of this myself." The officer's eyes widened. "Are you sure? The cracks have rendered the structure unstable and the fire is concentrated in the apartment." Shoyuta, unbothered, put on the gold-slotted goggles hanging around his neck. "Are all other tenants accounted for?" "Yes, but dash. I'm going in now." He surveyed the building, noting the leftmost stairwell seemed the least impacted by the bright, green waves of debris, and sprinted towards its entrance. He began his ascent, and soon found himself at the top floor. Shoyuta was immediately unnerved by the overwhelming quiet. Making his way towards apartment 417, part of him couldn't help but remain awestruck by this kid's, Izuku's, quirk. But what could possibly have triggered such a violent manifestation? Before he could even consider the possibilities, he reached the center of the calamity. Shuta's stomach turned. The room was straight out of hell. Flames and wreckage swirled all around, but he was able to quickly assess the situation. He immediately zeroed on the charred, withered corpses, Inko and Hisashi, resting in a pool of boiling blood. Additionally, he saw shards of glass and noted the faint stench of alcohol. Something terrible had happened here. Shifting his attention upwards, he was relieved to see he had Izuku within his sight and wasted no time activating his quirk. The tempest halted instantaneously and the green flames turned a familiar orange. Izuku went limp and began to fall. Shoyuta rushed towards the center of the dying blaze just in time to catch him. Holding the child in his arms as he ran down the stairs and out of the wreckage, Shoyuta carefully assessed his physical condition. To his dismay, he realized Izuku had been bleeding from his eyes, ears, nose, but luckily the flow had effectively stopped. It must have been some type of quirk overuse. More importantly, the boy's breathing was regular, though he had bruising all over indicating a recent beating and severe burns on his hands, arms, and face. Shoyuta clenched his jaw as he thought of the carnage behind them. The kid had a hell of a lot to wake up to. "You're just a quirkless loser, Deku. Stay the hell out of my way." The words cut into Izuku like daggers, and he raised his head to meet the sneer of his only friend, Bakugo Katsuki or Kachin, as he had always called him, before immediately averting his gaze. It had been 3 years since the pair had a civil conversation. 3 years since Izuku was declared quirkless and discarded by society, Kachin included. Kachin, I'm sorry, please. Izuku was cut off with a loud blast, and his shoulder exploded in white-hot pain. Bile rose in the back of his throat and his world swayed. Blood seeped through the right shoulder of his light, gray shirt, and with his cheeks wet and face fraught with terror, he turned and ran. Izuku Midoriya's life was not an easy one. Honestly, being quirkless in and of itself was hardly Izuku's biggest problem. That would be his father, Hisashi. Nothing Kachin could ever do or say would compare to the wounds, both physical and mental, his father inflicted on him. His mother, Inko, tried her best, but with her weak quirk, which consisted of the ability to pull small objects towards her, she was no match for Hisashi's drunken rampages. At 7 years old, Izuku had already been forced to accept the harsh reality of his existence. He could not be a hero like his idol, All Might. He could not even protect his own mother from his father. What business did he have trying to save others? Nevertheless, Inko encouraged him, saving up money to buy him a notebook for quirk analysis, a project he had started in a vain attempt to figure out his quirk, and continued because of the joy in his mother's eyes as he would read aloud his data and observations. Izuku could not bear to tell her he'd already given up. Izuku's lungs burned as his feet pounded against the pavement. He was still reeling that Kachin had just burnt him. The feeling was despicably familiar, but all of Izuku's scars were courtesy of Hisashi's rage. Kachin's words hurt, but his fists only left the occasional superficial bruise. Still, Izuku could never truly hate Kachin. He was his first friend after all. Lost in thought, Izuku forgot to pause at the door and listen for Hisashi. He opened it and his stomach dropped. "What the fuck happened to you?" Hisashi said, his speech slurred and lip curled in disgust. Izuku swallowed. "Nothing, I was just playing with Kachin, and he set off his quirk by Mr. Dash." "Liar." Hisashi snarled and lunged towards him. Instinctively, Izuku curled his arms into a defensive position as he felt the suffocating heat of his father's fire rain down. The stinging of his shoulder was immediately dwarfed by the pain coursing through his arms. His vision filled with dark spots, but Izuku just bit his tongue and slumped into a fetal position. Passing out now would only guarantee hell for his mother when she returned home. Useless piece of fucking crap. Hisashi's foot drove into his side. He felt something crack as his ribs erupted in agony. "You're a disgrace." Izuku shut his eyes tightly, his chest throbbing. "You ruined my life." He just had to hang on until his mother got home. His father usually stopped then. But Izuku had never seen his father like this. He wondered morbidly if he even had that long. Hisashi turned and grabbed the half-empty bottle of liquor stranded on the coffee table. He bent his arm and began to swing in the direction of Izuku's back. At that moment, Inko burst into the room. Her face, though pale, was contorted with rage. Without hesitation, she dove in front of Izuku. "Get away from him!" Her scream was interrupted by the shattering of the bottle on her neck. Izuku stared in horror at the crumpled figure of his mother in the growing pool of red. Tears streaming down his face, he grabbed onto her, his hands slipping in vain as he tried to hold pressure on her neck. Inko gasped for breath, but in all honesty, she had been prepared for something like this to happen one day. She regretted it was so soon though. Still, Inko was glad she had made her close friend Mitsuki Bakugo swear to take Izuku if anything ever happened to her. In her final moments, Inko summoned all her strength and managed to say the words she had rehearsed so often in her nightmares. "Please, Izuku, go run to safety. I'm sorry for not being able to protect you. I love you, my little hero." Her eyes dimmed, and she went limp in Izuku's arms. A terrible emptiness paralyzed Izuku. Hisashi stumbled backwards in horror. He had not intended to fatally wound Inko, but he had an unfortunate lack of fine motor control in his inebriated state. Hisashi's heart hammered in his chest, and he grasped at clumps of his oily, dark hair. With wild eyes, he spit out a frantic, "It's your fault," and an inferno of flame spewed from his lips. The alcohol covering Inko's body and the surrounding floor ignited instantaneously, and in a flash, the room was ablaze. Izuku could barely react as he heard the ceiling crack above him, and he made the mistake of looking up just in time for a flaming chunk of drywall to strike his left eye. He ignored the excruciating pain and held his mother tightly, despite his hands being consumed by the bright, orange flames coating her now scorching remains. Everything was so hot. Then it wasn't. His vision went white. For a moment, Izuku thought he had died. What with the weightlessness and all-encompassing light, it wasn't too much of a stretch, but before he could come to terms with that reality, the vision in his uninjured eye cleared. He looked down? Izuku realized he was midway between the floor and the ceiling, and that the fire swirling through the apartment had turned a glowing green. He caught a better look at his mother's burnt, mangled corpse and screamed. Izuku felt a mounting pressure in his head as all the debris in the room lifted into the air. Cracks rippled across the walls, emanating outwards. Fragments bathed in green flame whipped round the room as the fire spread faster. Hisashi just watched as terror thundered down upon him. This was impossible. Izuku was 7 years old. It was almost unheard of for a quirk to manifest so late. He took a step backwards to avoid the whirling blaze, but the floor was still wet with Inko's blood and Hisashi fell into the inferno. He died in seconds. Izuku watched in abject horror as the flesh melted off his father's bones. His breath quickened as the verdant tempest grew in intensity. The walls popped and splintered, the ceiling giving way to the sky. Izuku continued to rise, watching numbly as he saw the disaster unfold below. The flames were mostly concentrated in the ruins of his family's apartment, but the fissures spread throughout the building and into the road. Izuku hardly noticed the screams and frantic fleeing of his neighbors, and paid no mind to the police officers on street nor the pro-hero quickly making his way onto the scene. His entire body shook with tremors as he accepted the destruction as his own. This fire, this chaos, it was his. And he was all alone. No, Izuku whispered, he wanted it all to stop. His vision went dark this time. Katsuki stood alone in the park. He had really screwed up. It was useless Deku's fault, he assured himself. Losing control of his quirk just happened sometimes, and he hadn't meant to burn him, just rough him up a bit. He swallowed nervously and dreaded explaining this incident to his mother. Slowly beginning to make his way back home, Katsuki heard the faint wailing of sirens in the distance. It must have been a villain attack of some sort, but what would a villain want in such a boring neighborhood? And why in the middle of the day? He almost went to go check out the scene, but Deku was probably home by now, so Auntie Inko had likely already called and informed his mother of his outburst. Damn it, the old hag was going to make him do extra chores and call Deku and apologize, the latter being so much worse. Why should he have to say sorry anyways? It was an accident after all. Regardless, Katsuki found himself home far too quickly and winced as he opened the door, preparing himself for the inevitable harsh scolding. But instead he found his mother sitting on the kitchen floor, her back pressed against the refrigerator. Katsuki stopped himself as he caught sight of the tears streaming down her cheeks. He'd never seen his mother cry before, something was horribly wrong. Mitsuki turned towards her son shakily pointing to the phone in her hand, before looking away. Are you certain? She paused, color draining from her face at the response. How is Izuku? Katsuki could not move. Was he hearing things? Could this be? No, whatever had happened it sure as hell wasn't because he freaking punched Deku in the shoulder. His thoughts were interrupted by his mother's sudden exclamation. What the hell do you mean I can't see him? I am his emergency contact, you have no right. Her voice cracked. He's just a child. Please, at least tell me which hospital you're taking him to. She waited for a moment, nodding her head lightly, and thanked the officer before ending the call. Katsuki's chest ached with dread. What happened to Izuku? Mitsuki motioned him over and wrapped her arms around her son in an uncharacteristic display of affection. He was too afraid to protest. There was an accident at his house. The police aren't sure exactly what happened, but, she paused, Izuku is going to be fine. Katsuki did not really believe her, but before he could further question Deku's condition, he made a frightening realization. What about Auntie Inko? Why did they call you? Mitsuki hesitated, her eyebrows knitting in silent deliberation before she answered. Auntie Inko and Hisashi, her expression briefly darkened, are going to be away for a while. She gave her son a tight squeeze before gently releasing him. Please go to your room for a bit, I'm going to give your father a call. Katsuki slowly rose to his feet and walked out quietly. The sweet smell of nitroglycerin wafted into the air as nervous sweat condensed on his palms. Upon reaching his bedroom and kicking his door shut to avoid any accidental detonation, Katsuki threw down his arms and released a small flurry of explosions. The quick blast of heat only reignited his guilt from earlier. He felt nauseous as the implications of his mother's phone call set in. Katsuki may have been short-tempered, but what he lacked in restraint he made up for in intellect. Katsuki had noticed the angry red and purple gashes which frequently covered Deku's body. How he flinched whenever his father was mentioned. Katsuki remembered the one time he'd asked about it all. Why don't know anything, Kachin? Deku snarled, his face twisting in rage, but his eyes betrayed his fear. It is none of your business. Don't tell anyone. Katsuki was stunned, he had never seen him so angry before. I won't. Deku turned away, I'm going home. Katsuki had not told a soul, though he hadn't understood why the nerd had gotten so angry at him. He was just trying to help. Why couldn't Deku see that? Katsuki regretted keeping his promise. He wondered if he'd ever get the chance to apologize. Shoyuta sat outside Izuku's hospital room. It was a precautionary measure. If the boy's quirk went out of control again, he could assist. But, though the crisis was over, Shoyuta did not feel like he had saved anyone at all. The stench of alcohol, the broken glass, the defensive burns on the kid's forearms, it painted a picture he'd seen so many times before. Shoyuta had been far too late. Lost in thought, he hardly noticed when a man and woman in business attire approached him. The woman spoke first. I apologize for the intrusion, but I need to speak with you, Eraserhead. Who are you? I am Agent Arakawa Yuriko with the Hero Commission. She reached into the front pocket of her dark pantsuit and pulled out a small badge before continuing. And this is my colleague, Agent Iwata Goro. The man merely bowed his head, and Arakawa went on. One of the primary goals of the Hero Commission is to provide resources for vulnerable minors with powerful quirks. Some higher-ups caught wind of this incident. She paused, as if considering her next words carefully, and we believe Midoriya Izuku to be an excellent candidate for our assistance. Can you tell me what you observed about his quirk? Shoyuta was wary of Arakawa. She was most certainly aware of Izuku's serious injuries, but her focus solely on the boy's quirk betrayed an apparent lack of concern regarding his general well-being. He had just been orphaned. Still, Shoyuta wasn't exactly in a position to question Arakawa's motives. The Hero Commission was no joke. Izuku seems to possess a combination of telekinesis and pyrokinesis. He responded flatly. I see, and what of his range? The telekinesis reached far outside the complex. The whole block took damage. However, the fire stayed concentrated in the apartment, suggesting either a lower radius of control or a subconscious desire to not spread the conflagration, possibly both. Shoyuta bit his lip, part of him regretting the analysis he just recited. Surely it had only piqued Arakawa's interest in the child. Not that he knew much about the Hero Commission's operations, but he didn't have a great feeling about the assistance they were planning on giving. He tried to dismiss the thought, though. It wasn't as if minimizing the boy's potential would do any good in the long term. With a power like that, control was absolutely essential. Interesting. And both of his parents are confirmed to be deceased. Shoyuta blinked. The cavalier nature with which she tacked on the question left a bitter taste in his mouth. Yes. Arakawa turned to Iwata, and the man reached into a briefcase at his side. He removed a thin, manila file and handed it to her. The Hero Commission will be seeking custody of Midoriya Izuku? Well, that was quick. But, Shoyuta frowned. Didn't the boy have another emergency contact? He vaguely remembered one of the officers calling a bakugu something after Izuku was loaded into the ambulance. Arakawa, unaware, or at least unconcerned with his shifting expression, removed an official-looking document from the folder and handed it to him, along with a pen. Please sign this form, indicating you experienced his quirk firsthand. Shoyuta didn't move for a moment, instead opting to scan the paper. The form appeared to be an intake document for the hero development program. Before he could even uncap the pen, shouting broke out down the hall. "You need to let me through right fucking now. I am Midoriya Izuku's legal guardian. This is against the law." Arakawa immediately walked towards the angry woman, who was yelling at the police officers guarding the entrance to the ward. Individuals with out-of-control quirks were treated in designated areas of hospitals with higher security for safety purposes. Shoyuta followed her, the paper in his hand suddenly seeming quite heavy. "Hello, I am Agent Arakawa with the Hero Commission. You are Bakugo Mitsuki, correct?" The woman's red eyes narrowed. "Yes, that's me." Arakawa first dismissed the officers and continued, "Midoriya Izuku has been determined to be a threat to society in his current state. We will provide him with the proper training he requires to be an influential hero." "What are you talking about? He isn't doing any hero training. He is 7 years old and was orphaned 2 hours ago." Arakawa interrupted, "And did he not play a role in that?" "Then how dare you? He's a child. You don't know what that house was like. I'd bet anything it's that drunk, son of bitch Hisashi's fault." She fought back tears, digging her nails into her palms. Shoyuta cut in, "In my professional opinion, there was a struggle preceding the boy's quirk usage. As such violent manifestations require a highly traumatic event, it is very likely Midoriya Inko was killed in front of him." "It doesn't matter." All eyes shifted back to Arakawa, who seemed irritated by Bakugo-san's outburst. He almost certainly killed Midoriya Hisashi and could have killed or injured many more people had the evacuation been any less efficient. Without guidance he most certainly will in the future. Shoyuta couldn't exactly argue with that, and neither could Bakugo-san, though it looked as if she desperately wanted to. Arakawa continued, "Besides, you do not have a choice. Your status as Midoriya Izuku's legal guardian has been suspended." The blonde woman glared harshly, "On what grounds?" Sighing in annoyance, Arakawa responded, "He is a danger to society. The Hero Commission has the resources he requires." "So what? I just hand him over to you people?" Bakugo-san hesitated, pressing her lips together as she processed the futility of her situation. "At least let me see him." Shoyuta answered quickly, "That can be arranged." He looked coldly at Arakawa, daring her to argue. She did not. Glancing back at the form in his hands, he clicked open the pen and scrawled his name inside the box marked Pro Hero Endorsement and Quirk Verification. He knew it was the only choice, but handing over the paper Shoyuta could not help but feel shame, as if he had effectively signed the boy's life away. "Thank you, Eraserhead." Arakawa looked relieved Bakugo-san had calmed down, the last hints of her frustration giving way to her default cold indifference. She turned to address the woman directly, "If you must see Midoriya, it should be now while he is still unconscious. His quirk is currently too unstable for any other type of visitation." The blonde woman crossed her arms. "Fine." Mitsuki was completely overwhelmed. She had rushed to the hospital as soon as her husband Masaru had arrived home from work, and though she hadn't known what to expect, it certainly wasn't this. Following Eraserhead and Arakawa, she considered her position. She couldn't bear the thought of breaking her promise to Inko, yet. Right in here. The doctor, a kind-looking middle-aged woman, had been waiting by Izuku's room. She gestured towards the entrance. Mitsuki paused for a moment, then she opened the door. Bandages covered the boy's arms, torso, neck, and half his face, including his left eye, much to her concern. On the areas of visible skin, there was an abundance of fresh, reddish bruising. Mitsuki could only imagine what damage lay beneath the layers of gauze. However, one particular detail stood out among Izuku's injuries. What happened to his hair? His hair? Eraserhead responded, his eyebrows raised. Mitsuki was beyond confused. Save for an inch or so of green around the roots, it was white. It was completely green this morning. A moment of silence followed, before Aha, eyes wide, noted, "Incredible. It must be quirk-related then." Well, that was a lot to process, but after the initial shock, Mitsuki couldn't care less at the moment, not with the severity of his other injuries. Will he be all right? It was a childish question. After all, That sketchy hero commission asshole was obviously confident in the kid's capabilities, but Mitsuki couldn't help herself. The doctor responded promptly. Midoriya has severe burns on his arms, face, and hands. He will likely have nerve damage and a reduction in dexterity, though with proper treatment a full recovery can be expected. She paused. However, his left eye was irrevocably damaged in the fire. It is too soon to speak definitively, but a permanent loss of vision in that eye is likely. Mitsuki clenched her jaw. Hadn't this child gone through enough? Arakawa's expression softened slightly. Perhaps she did have a heart, and she noted, the boy will have access to the highest quality medical treatment. Given the nature of his quirk, his current physical state is not projected to be a significant hindrance. Before Mitsuki could respond, the heart monitor, which had been emitting a steady series of beeps, started to speed up. He's waking up, the doctor noted. I'm sorry, with the exception of Eraserhead, you have to please clear out of the room. Drifting into consciousness, Izuku was filled with a sense of warmth. Everything around him felt so dynamic, and he instinctively shifted and pulled his surroundings. It was strange, yet freeing, like he had lived his entire life indoors and was now bathing in sunlight for the very first time. For a moment, Izuku was more alive than he had ever been, enjoying the comforting glow. Then everything went cold. His body exploded in sudden, far-reaching pain, but immediately any physical discomfort was overtaken by a deep, horrible emptiness. Opening his eyes, he dismissed it for the moment, more concerned with omnipresent chill seeping into his bones. Izuku expected an infinite blackness. Instead, he was met with white walls and overly bright fluorescence. By squinting his uncovered eye, he was able to make out a man with shoulder-length black hair and glowing red eyes staring at him. Izuku desperately wanted to call out, to somehow alleviate the terrible all-consuming solitude, but before he could, he felt a sharp twinge below his shoulder. Izuku looked to see a syringe lodged in his upper arm. Turning back, he saw the man's eyes dim, and as abruptly as the coldness had arrived, it vanished, leaving Izuku uncomfortably lukewarm. At least the vibrant heat from earlier had partially returned, though restricted. The brief lull allowed Izuku's thoughts to finally settle. It wasn't the first time he'd woken up in the hospital. No, that was a disgustingly normalized part of his life, but his mother was always by his side. Where was she now? The day's events came rushing back in an instant. His father's wrath, his mother's life ripped away by shards of glass. Then the flames, his father's screams. He'd made him scream, the twisted corpses on the floor. His fire. His swirling debris. The destruction was his. The color drained from Izuku's already sickly pale face. But, strangely enough, he spilled no tears. No, why should he cry? His father wasn't there to hurt him, his mother wasn't there to be hurt. Izuku was without anyone to protect or be protected from. All the hurt and fear and love that had always overflowed in the form of bright smiles disrupting tear-stained cheeks collapsed into an expanse of numbing apathy. Hey kid, can you tell me your name? Izuku looked at the dark-haired man and realized he was speaking to him. He flinched, automatically shrinking away before responding. Midoriya Izuku? His throat was raw. Right? Do you know where you are? The man winced slightly at his own question. I am in the hospital. Izuku took a moment to examine his injuries. His torso, arms, hands, and half his face, including his left eye, were wrapped in bandages. If these weren't the deepest burns he'd ever gotten, they were certainly the most widespread. Izuku wondered what the scars would look like. He wouldn't be able to hide them like the others. Not that he cared at the moment. The man nodded at his response and introduced himself. I am Eraserhead. He paused, as if unsure exactly how to continue. I know my parents are dead. The words, which should have burnt Izuku's lips and sent him spiraling into a sorrowful panic, hung lifelessly in the air. How could he feel nothing at such a time? What sort of person was he? Eraserhead's eyes widened. It was only natural after such an insanely aloof declaration. He managed a stilted yes, then proceeded, his face softening. Do you want to talk about it? No, Izuku leaned back into his pillow and began to inspect the ceiling. I have a quirk now? Izuku almost frowned. Part of him had known that back in the apartment, but nevertheless the words felt strange on his tongue. You do. It is rare, but quirks can manifest past the age of 4 under certain circumstances. Of course, Izuku knew that. Stressful events could trigger dormant quirks, but he had already been subject to so much violence throughout the course of his life he had dismissed the possibility a while ago. Eraserhead continued, You immediately activated it when you woke up. How did it feel? Izuku wasn't exactly sure how to explain the sensation, so he kept it relatively simple. It was nice and warm, then freezing cold. His face darkened ever so slightly, and there was a moment of quiet before the man responded. I apologize, that was my fault. I erased your quirk as you woke up so the nurse could give you suppressants. Instinctive and accidental quirk usage is normal after manifestation. You will get help to learn control, but first you need to focus on recovering. So that's what the shot was. Izuku shivered at the thought of his quirk being erased again, remnants of the dreadful emptiness continuing to cling to him. Though, the idea of needing to learn control was almost laughable. Besides, any help Izuku had ever received in his short, miserable life had been minimal at best. He suddenly thought of Auntie Mitsuki. She was supposed to watch him if anything happened to his mother. Where was she? Where is Aon? He stopped, correcting himself. Bokogu Mitsuki? His voice remained void of emotion, but deep down he desperately wanted to see her, to hold tightly to the last connection tethering him to life as he knew it. I'm sorry, kid, but she can't see you right now. She really wants to, but, he sighed, right now it just isn't safe. And in an instant, Izuku was adrift. The remaining shreds of his former existence had slipped completely out of reach. However, Eraserhead wasn't finished. There are some people from the Hero Commission that are going to help you with your quirk. In the meantime, try to get some rest. He shifted from one foot to the other. Things will get better. Eraserhead left the room. Izuku, even in his disoriented state, recognized the significance of the Hero Commission's involvement. A cold burn rose briefly in his chest before sinking down into the pit of his stomach. He really was someone to be feared. No wonder Auntie Mitsuki didn't want anything to do with him. She should stay far away. Izuku had plenty of experience with fear. He'd been afraid of his father, sometimes afraid of Kachin, but never of himself. Yet, amazingly, right now he was only scared of himself. The damage Izuku was capable of, there was no one in this world that could love him now. The only person who ever truly did was his mother, and he pushed the thought away. Briefly, Izuku wondered if he'd ever see Kachin again, unsure if he even wanted to. Kachin simply had no place in his new reality, where he was the one needing restraint. He was the one with the power to hurt. He didn't want to hurt him. The glowing green light. His quirk activated instantaneously upon regaining consciousness? Arakawa bombarded Shoyuta with the question before the door to Izuku's room could even fully close. Yes. Shoyuta responded monotonously. Fascinating. Can you describe exactly what happened? The woman's eyebrows were raised in excitement, and she held a thin notepad. Shoyuta frowned, the sheer power of Izuku's quirk. It was frightening to say the least. The glow indicated everything was under his telekinetic influence, and with it the room's temperature increased. The walls swayed, and smaller objects began to rise up. I erased his quirk before the situation could escalate. He paused, glancing sideways. Despite the incredible strength displayed earlier, he showed no signs of quirk exhaustion. Her mouth curved into a smile. Quite a promising report. She waited a moment. How would you assess his mental state? Shoyuta wished he could feel relieved by Arakawa's apparent concern, but he knew she was only asking out of necessity. I believe Izuku's having trouble processing his emotions. He was startlingly distant, almost apathetic, but given his upbringing, a typical response to such a traumatic event isn't unusual. There's most certainly a terrified child hiding behind that cold exterior. He narrowed his eyes. Don't forget that. The woman crossed her arms defensively, but her sloping shoulders gave away the slightest hints of shame. Shoyuta went on. Izuku does not appear to have any memory loss surrounding the incident, but, understandably, he did not wish to speak about it. I have yet to discuss the case with the police, but that will not be an issue. Arakawa interrupted. a discernible habit of hers. Given the circumstances, there will be no formal investigation into the deaths of the Midoriyas. What? Why not? We have determined the circumstances do not require further examination. Neither had any living relatives nor long-term employment to speak of, and the only close personal contact of the family appears to be Bokugu Mitsuki. So you're just sweeping this under the rug because they won't be missed? What about closure for the kid? Shoyuta was fuming. This bureaucratic nonsense was only going to exacerbate Izuku's guilt. With a formal case, at least he'd have a better chance of accepting his actions were in self-defense, and more importantly, be able to honor his mother and see his father face justice. Better late than never. Arakawa responded before Shoyuta could say anything else. Whatever you think Izuku would gain from legal proceedings is inconsequential. The fact of the matter is this. A trial would only take up time and energy. For what? To condemn the actions of a dead man? To absolve a child of a manslaughter charge he need not bear in the first place? He shouldn't suffer because of your perception of closure. The Hero Commission will focus on letting him move forward. Shoyuta wanted to scream that the only difference between a manslaughter charge and the reality of accidentally killing your father was a slip of paper, and that moving forward without properly acknowledging trauma just poisoned you from the inside out, an experience he was bitterly familiar with. Instead, Shoyuta clenched his jaw. This argument was pointless. He had absolutely no authority over the situation, and it was likely Arakawa didn't either. She was just following orders, albeit obnoxiously. She took notice of his begrudging silence and continued, "Assuming Izuku's condition remains stable, we will be moving him to one of our facilities in 2 days. Your services are no longer required. Thank you for your cooperation." Shoyuta nodded stiffly. He knew there was nothing he could do at the moment, but this child had been failed by heroes once. He wasn't letting him go completely. Shoyuta resolved to stay in contact with Bokugu-san. At the very least, he could help to keep tabs on Izuku. He only hoped it would be enough. "Katsuki, how was your session?" Making his way into the lobby, he merely glared in response. It was bad enough he had to go to a psychologist. He certainly didn't want to talk about it with his mother. Following her wordlessly to the car, he reflected on the past few days. When she told him he wouldn't see Deku for a while, Katsuki feared the worst. In a state of panic, he told her all of the awful things he'd done to him. Katsuki thought his mother would be so angry. If he hadn't hurt Deku at the park, none of this would have happened, but instead she just looked sad. Flash forward half a week, and he just had his first therapy appointment. Controlling his anger, what bullcrap. What did it matter if he was pissed off? It was a hero's job to win, not to worry about hurting people's feelings. And Katsuki needed to focus on winning now more than ever. After all, he'd never felt like such a loser. Katsuki knew it was dumb. No one had actually beaten him, there hadn't even been a fight, but part of him was screaming the truth. He had failed. It was all his fault. It was all his fault. It was all his fault. Deku might be annoying, but he didn't deserve all this, and Katsuki was too weak, completely unable to do anything about it. Izuku watched the cityscape pass by through the tinted SUV window. Mothers pushed children in strollers, businessmen rushed around on their lunch breaks, teenagers lounged in cafe patios, everyone was going about their day-to-day activities. The scene seemed so foreign. He found it difficult to process that society just continued on as if nothing had happened. Izuku's only remaining possessions, few photos and his quirk analysis notebooks, lay in a small, black backpack by his feet. He wondered what the training facility agent Arakawa had spoke of would look like. Catching a glimpse of his own reflection, he frowned. Izuku was shocked and upset when he first looked in a mirror at the hospital. He missed his green hair, it had always reminded him of his mother, and his left eye was still wrapped in bandages. "I'm afraid you're probably going to lose vision in that eye." The doctor looked at Izuku, her brows drawing together in concern as she paused for a moment. "But half-blindness isn't as uncommon as you might think, and once you adjust you will be able to live a normal life." Thinking back, it was almost funny, like he would ever be able to live a normal life. Besides, with all the information thrown at him in the hospital, Izuku couldn't really process the significance of his half-blindness. It just was? He didn't have enough energy to worry about it then. The quirk suppressants had sapped his energy and made concentrating nearly impossible. Now, Izuku was finally off of them, something about needing to flush out his system so they could properly test his quirk, and he still didn't really care. He was preoccupied by the sense of warmth from earlier returning even stronger. It was as if everything around him was vibrating at different frequencies, just begging to be sped up. Izuku had to resist the urge to push and pull at it all. Though he was not doing a great job. The car was noticeably too hot, and glancing towards the passenger seat, Izuku could see beads of sweat forming on Agent Arakawa's forehead. He felt a little guilty, but he couldn't exactly help it, and besides, she wasn't very nice. Now a half hour or so outside the urban area, the car approached the largest building Izuku had ever seen. It was a tall mass of concrete, metal, and glass, reminding him of some kind of industrial factory. Agent Arakawa's face brightened, and she turned back to face Izuku. "We're here." If possible, the building seemed bigger inside. Izuku followed Agent Arakawa through what felt like miles of pristine, identical hallways. Eventually, they turned into a room, and he found himself standing in a sizable office in front of an older man sitting at a desk. "Hello, Izuku. Feel free to please sit down." The man motioned towards a large leather chair opposite his desk. He nodded towards Agent Arakawa, who closed the door and remained standing in the back of the room. Izuku slowly took a seat. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You can call me Dr. Kuroda." Izuku managed a short, "Nice to meet you." "It is a pleasure to meet you as well. I understand the last few days have been very difficult, and everything seems very scary right now, but remember we are all here to help you." Dr. Kuroda folded his hands on the table. "Welcome to the Hero Development Program." Hero Development Program? In hindsight, the declaration should not have come as such a surprise. It was the Hero Commission after all, but no one had explicitly told Izuku what was happening, just that he was going to learn to control his quirk. Besides, he had forgotten his dream so long ago, and with everything that happened, surely he couldn't be a hero now. The doctor studied him, his eyes combing over Izuku, as if looking for a response. He wanted to plead with Dr. Kuroda that there'd been a mistake, and there was no way he could ever save anyone, but it would have been futile. Izuku wasn't stupid. He knew no one here cared how he felt. It was clear from how little anything was explained to him. They hadn't even mentioned his parents. He wondered if his mother had a proper funeral. So, he remained expressionless, simply nodding his head. Izuku was almost shocked. Staying detached had never been so easy before. He liked it. If the doctor was surprised he didn't show it, and continued on. "Today you will be examined so we can get some baseline physical information, and then tomorrow we will begin testing your quirk." Quirk testing? Izuku realized he could finally add himself into his analysis books. Really, the journals should seem trivial now, but he found himself suddenly longing for their familiar methodical nature. Yes, Izuku had only kept up with them because of his mother, but the idea of escaping into the world of analysis, especially now when it wouldn't just serve as a painful reminder of his quirkless status, was comforting. As part of the program, all of your needs will be provided for. Dr. Kuroda leaned back into his chair. "You will live here at the facility and have access to the best tutors and training Japan has to offer." Izuku blinked. Tutors? He liked school. It was a safe place for him, relative to home anyway. Despite the bullying and taunts from Kachin and the others, he really did enjoy his studies. He had assumed that he wouldn't be going back to his school, but the concept of personal tutoring was just so far removed from anything Izuku had ever experienced. He hadn't considered not going back at all. However, he wasn't too bothered by the prospect. Besides, once the idea settled in, it wasn't too surprising. Izuku would endanger the other students. "Do you have any questions?" Once again, the doctor pored over Izuku, dispassionately scrutinizing him. It was uncomfortable. Izuku shook his head. "Excellent. Agent Arakawa can show you to your room now." Dr. Kuroda beckoned the woman and handed her a small key card. Izuku stood up, intending to follow Agent Arakawa out of the room, but the doctor had one last parting message. "We are expecting great things from you, Izuku." The words rang in his ears as he returned to the monotonous expanse of hallways. Nothing had ever been expected of him before. Was this how it felt to be strong? Name, Midoriya Izuku. Quirk, Atom Fire Matter Control. Description, can change increase the speed of molecules. Capabilities, push/pull matter, including self. Increase temperature of matter, melts or bursts into flame, can control externally created fire as well. Send shock waves through material, results in cracks. Can sense surrounding matter, X can determine location/speed of projectiles. Physical characteristics, higher than normal body temperature. Can get slight fever when using quirk on self, though body temperature runs high. Accidentally heats up surroundings. Heating of manipulated matter is hard to control, especially of biological material. Izuku sat in his barren room. It was nice enough, consisting of a bed, nightstand, desk, small bookshelf, home to his notebooks, and attached bathroom. The door was locked from the outside, but he didn't really care. It wasn't as if he had somewhere else to be. During the past couple days, Izuku had gone through rigorous testing. For the most part, using his quirk felt safe and freeing, but the entropy of a system wants to increase. He tried his best to limit the urge to stir up his surroundings, but the moment Izuku got the slightest bit temperamental, everything always descended into chaos. He stared at the last line of his own analysis page, his mind drifting back to yesterday's disastrous session. They were testing him against biological dummies. The idea was simple enough. Some quirks interact differently with living and non-living entities, but it felt a little unnecessary. Earlier, Izuku had successfully been able to manipulate some saplings, though they had seemed more combustible than inorganic matter with similar flammability, and the dummy in front of him was far too humanoid for Izuku's liking. Still, he felt the familiar cloak of heat wrapping around him as he focused on levitating it. The instant Izuku's power reached the dummy, he sensed something was very wrong. The matter was moving way too fast. Panicking, he tried in vain to slow the molecules down, but it was to no avail. In seconds, the stench of burnt flesh filled the air, and the flaming dummy was violently thrashed about, flailing and twisting faster as he completely lost control. The fire, the smell, the body, it was just like before. Izuku screamed. Cracks radiated through the reinforced steel floor that should have been resistant to his shock waves, and hot air whipped every which way, some currents igniting in broad streams of green flame. Izuku started to rise, this time painfully aware of turmoil he'd caused. The dummy body was so easy to burn. People were so fragile. He saw a luminescent gray mist pour out of the vents that lined the floor and ceiling of the testing room. Everything went black. Izuku heard a distant crashing sound as he succumbed to the darkness. He shivered at the memory, absent-mindedly rubbing at the track marks on his arms. They'd injected him with quirk suppressants as a preventative measure after the gas had rendered him unconscious. Apparently, Izuku had a strange reaction to them. Not only did he require twice as high a dosage as Dr. Kuroda had expected, but despite the fact his quirk had just barely been restrained, he'd gone almost hypothermic and woke up with an awful migraine. Individuals with emitter-type quirks most often experienced acute mental distress from suppressants, but there shouldn't have been any physical symptoms. The doctor was quite excited by that development. Izuku's thoughts were interrupted by the door opening. He turned to face Nurse Suzuki, a tall woman with cropped red hair and tired eyes. She was holding a small tray with medical equipment. "Good morning, Izuku. Did you sleep well?" False concern, he noted. After all, his room had cameras, and he'd been sedated. "Yes." Izuku returned his focus to his notebook. Nurse Suzuki continued, "Good. If you could please relax, I'll be removing the bandages over your eye now." He complied, and the woman began taking off the dressings. The covered skin was sensitive, but the process was short and relatively painless. "You can try opening your eye. It's okay if you can't see out of it." Izuku opened his left eye and looked at Nurse Suzuki. She was glowing? There seemed to be a light emanating from her torso. He blinked. It was still there. "How is your vision?" Izuku shut his healthy eye and examined the woman again. Now he could only see the light, everything else was dark. It wasn't a specific color exactly, it kept shifting despite a constant luminosity, but somehow he could tell it was Nurse Suzuki, as if he was looking at her face. "I can see a light with my left eye." I think it is coming from you, he said candidly. She frowned in confusion. I will alert Dr. Kuroda. In the meantime, would you like a mirror? Izuku paused, then nodded, and the woman handed him one off her tray. He inhaled sharply. A jagged, dark burn scar cut over his eye. As to his eye, it was an eerie milky green and did not look like it should be seeing much of anything. Izuku was almost frightened by his reflection. He'd always been fairly plain-looking, his formerly green hair being his most outstanding feature. Now he looked scary. Izuku guessed it was fitting. Later, he met with Dr. Kuroda who, upon listening to Izuku's observations, immediately dedicated the rest of the day to determining the specifics of his eye's ability. It appeared that his eye could detect people's auras. Each was unique, though the brightness remained the same, and the stronger a person's quirk, the more saturated the light. Izuku could recognize people by their auras, even if their face was covered, though the person's figure had to be apparent. So it worked if someone was masked/dressed head to toe, but not if they were standing behind a wall or under a blanket. Dr. Kuroda hypothesized that because his quirk had manifested immediately after his eye was injured, it responded to the physical stress by developing his matter-sensing capabilities in that area. Izuku was fascinated by this new, non-lethal component of his quirk, but he didn't have too much time to theorize about it. Tomorrow was the official start of his training. Standing behind a large window, Izuku watched the session going on in the main floor. He'd been told there were currently 2 other children, or trainees, in this facility, but they were already highly skilled, so Izuku would be practicing separately for the time being. Izuku's trainer, an overly enthusiastic man who went by Mori-sensei, turned to him. Quite impressive, right? Izuku nodded. It was almost like watching pro heroes on TV. They were both boys and by the looks of it much older than him. Their auras were incredibly dense, and he was almost overwhelmed by the magnitude of their presence. It felt strangely heavy. That's Kigo. Mori-sensei gestured towards the blonde boy with red wings, who was currently using his feathers to intercept spheres fired from the opposite wall. Kigo's control of each feather was amazing, but the speed with which he deflected the projectiles was on a whole different level. Izuku felt them slice through the air faster than he could visually process. Then, the man pointed to the other child, a boy with dark red hair and cutting eyes, who was incinerating his portion of the spheres with bright, blue flames. Something about seeing flames in another person's control made Izuku feel slightly sick, like he could get burnt again at any moment. Especially since, even from the distance, he could sense the rapid rate of combustion. The fire was hot. At least as hot as Izuku's, if not more so. And that's Tuya. It had been about a month since Shoyuta had vowed to keep tabs on Izuku. The hero development program was fairly top secret, so he hadn't had much luck investigating it directly. However, he had succeeded in one key discovery. Apparently there was a fine legal line between temporary custody of indeterminate length and permanent custody. As the Hero Commission only had authority on the former, there was the chance of Mitsuki, as she'd insisted on being called, possibly gaining guardianship of Izuku in the future. Unfortunately, that day was a long way off, and more unfortunately, the only way Shoyuta had of estimating just how long was calling his only Hero Commission contact, Agent Arakawa. So, Shoyuta found himself ruining a perfectly good morning, well, technically afternoon, he'd been patrolling all night, by dialing her number. Agent Arakawa speaking. Her voice was even and unbothered. Hello, this is the pro-hero Eraserhead. I am calling to follow up on the treatment of Midoriya Izuku. I'm sorry that information is classified - Please, Shoyuta interrupted for once, just a general comment. There was a moment of quiet, then Arakawa responded. He is making progress and seems to be adjusting adequately. He breathed a sigh of relief. Shoyuta knew she wouldn't actually tell him any significantly negative information on the boy's condition, but it didn't seem like she was lying. That is good to hear. May I ask when he will be allowed to see Bakugo-san? She still has rights to permanent custody. It was a risky question, but Shoyuta knew visitation was a critical first step. He planned to call and request periodically. After all, she would have to respond eventually. Another pause followed, this one far longer than the last. Not for at least another 6 months, she said hesitantly, If you really want to arrange a visit, ask again then. When was the last time Shoyuta had been pleasantly surprised? Part of him desperately wanted to ask what prompted this change of heart, but he knew better than to look a gift horse in the mouth. So, he kept his response simple. Thank you. You're welcome. Is that all? Arakawa's tone slipped back to its usual harshness. Yes. The line beeped signifying the end of the call. 6 months, he'd have to let Mitsuki know. We're doing something a little different today. Izuku just stared at Mori-sensei. He'd only just settled into the rhythm of the past couple weeks. Physical conditioning in the morning. He was pretty weak from perpetual malnourishment, followed by a tutoring session and then long hours of quirk training. Though, before Izuku could ask exactly he meant, the door opened and his stomach dropped. Hello, Tuya. Thanks for helping out with Izuku's training today. Mori-sensei said brightly. Izuku had met Tuya and Kigo before. They all had mandatory, free time once a week. Additionally, unlike most adults at the Hero Commission, Mori-sensei occasionally remembered they were children and let them play in an empty gym. However, Izuku had been largely uninterested in interacting with the other two. He never had good friends before, Kachin didn't count, and besides they were way older than him, 5 years older, and probably only being nice because they had to. Also, Tuya made him uneasy. Every time the boy used his quirk, Izuku was reminded of his father. It was strange. Initially he was afraid of getting hurt, but as his training progressed, he became more afraid of losing control. Strong emotions were dangerous, fear was dangerous, and the frequent injections of suppressants served as a painful reminder. Izuku was dangerous. It's no trouble. Tuya walked over to where he and Mori-sensei were standing and smiled at Izuku. We'll be testing how his flame control is affected by fire quirk users. Okay, so this was going to be awful. It wasn't like Izuku didn't want to know. In fact, he was admittedly very curious. His quirk did fascinate him even if he hated it, but the looming risk of a flare-up stifled his curiosity. Whatever, he didn't have a choice anyway. Mori-sensei continued, start by releasing a little flame. Tuya nodded and was instantly cloaked in a light blue blaze. Izuku instinctively flinched away but managed to resist the urge to stumble backwards. Izuku, can you try and move it around? He took a deep breath and focused on feeling the flames. The molecules buzzed and crashed together, and he gave in to the constant pressure to speed it all up. Tuya's flames brightened and grew in intensity, and Izuku tried to push them away. Immediately, the fire turned a brilliant green and an innumerable blend of scalding currents ripped it away. The wisps of flame zipped off in different directions and in seconds they were all completely extinguished. An astonished silence filled the air. Then Tuya spoke, his eyes wide. Wow. That was incredible. Izuku was confused at his excitement. He'd just stolen his flames, wasn't that a bad thing? Mori-sensei interrupted his thoughts. Yes, well done. Let's do it again, this time try and pull it towards you. Well, that sounded like a terrible plan. Izuku wanted the fire away from him. Still, Tuya lit up and Izuku tried to draw the blaze in. This time, flows of emerald flames rushed in his direction, converging and wrapping around him in a swirling conflagration. He panicked. And then came the flare-up. The room's temperature rose as a bright, white glow illuminated Izuku's surroundings. His arms began to bend in a defensive position, an entirely pointless reflex since Izuku had yet to really burn himself with his own fire, but the motion was interrupted by Mori-sensei gripping his sleeve, preventing him from involuntarily levitating, and injecting him with a syringe of suppressants. Mori-sensei's quirk, shooting laser beams from his palms, meant he had a fairly high heat tolerance and was thus able to reach through fire without injury. After the second flare-up he'd started keeping suppressants in his utility belt to prevent things from getting out of hand. Izuku failed to appreciate the preparedness as he fell to his knees, gasping for breath as the bone-chilling cold seeped through his veins. Whoa, what was that? Is he okay? Tuya had moved out of range of the conflagration and was now knitting his brows in concern. Yes, no need to worry. He is still learning control, so dampening the effect of his quirk allows him to safely calm down. He moved his gaze to Izuku, who had begun to shiver. That was a promising start. I'll go get Nurse Suzuki to take you back to your room. The man left, and Tuya approached Izuku, crouching down beside him. He frowned, noticing his trembling. "Are you cold?" Izuku looked away. Why couldn't he just leave him alone already? "Yes," he said flatly. Tuya's frown deepened, and he shifted uncomfortably. "Do you want me to warm you up?" He couldn't respond fast enough, no. The thought of more fire swirling around him, especially in this indefensible state, was simply unbearable. The red-haired boy hesitated again, his lips pressing together in silent deliberation. "If you just take my hands, I can do it without visible flames." Izuku's mouth opened slightly as he stared at Tuya. Without visible flames? For a moment, he wondered how he knew that was the problem, but on second thought it was painfully obvious given his behavior. Izuku would probably be embarrassed if he wasn't so cold. With his head pounding, the migraine was already starting, Izuku shakily grabbed onto Tuya's outstretched hands. Instantly, he felt a comforting heat emanate from the touch. Izuku let himself warm up for a bit, before withdrawing his arms. Even in his suppressed state, it was dangerous for him to have prolonged physical contact with others. He'd accidentally heat them up. Glancing to his side, Izuku managed a quiet, "Thank you." Tuya smiled. "Anytime," his face softened, "and I'm here if you ever want to talk." Confused, Izuku nodded. Maybe Tuya wasn't afraid because he also had a fire quirk? He probably should still be afraid. But, scared or not, why was he being so nice? There was nothing Izuku could do for him. Is this what heroes were like? At that moment, Mori-sensei re-entered the room, accompanied by Nurse Suzuki. "Come Izuku, let's go," she said, holding out an insulated, gray blanket, meant to keep him from going hypothermic on suppressants. After getting up and walking over, he wrapped the fabric around himself, and noted just how much warmer he felt than usual. Looking over at Tuya once more, Izuku hesitated, then waved goodbye. It was the least he could after he was so kind. He wanted to see him again soon. The boy grinned and waved back. "How much weight can your feathers support?" Kigo looked at Izuku, who was sitting next to him on the couch in the common room, writing information about his quirk in a notebook. Just what sort of kid spent the entirety of their 2 hours off a week taking notes? The bigger ones can lift an average adult, but it varies based on size. Izuku nodded, his face glued to the page in front of him as he added the information. In all honesty, the boy had grown on him over the past couple months. After all, Kigo had never been that great with little kids, and for the better part of the last 2 years the only non-adult he saw was Tuya. However, that was pretty inconsequential as he soon figured Izuku did not act like the average 7-year-old one bit. The kid was smart. Seriously, he had to be some sort of genius, and he was obsessed with quirks. Tuya was the one who noticed Izuku was always writing analysis, and not just like doodling or something as Kigo had assumed, and discovered that was the easiest way to get him to talk. Interestingly, he never seemed to want to discuss his own quirk, but, after all, none of them were at the Hero Commission because of their perfect home lives. He had bounced around the foster care system himself. The burns on Izuku's face and arms and the unnatural pale green of his left eye, Kigo could only imagine what horrors he had experienced. Lost in thought, he was startled by Tuya storming in. The second Kigo saw his face, he realized something was very wrong. Tears stained the redhead's cheeks and his face was flushed. "I hate him," Tuya said darkly, flinging himself onto a nearby chair. Izuku had stopped writing and was looking at the agitated boy, eyes wide. Kigo realized he'd never seen an Endeavor outburst before. What did Fuyumi say? He knew it was usually better for Tuya to just talk it out. "Mom's been getting worse, he's been making her worse, His eyes squeezed shut and a tear fell. "She hurt Shoto?" He let out a light sob. "Shit. This was bad." Tuya had been dreading some sort of incident. He was extra protective of his little brother, the new target of Endeavor's wrath, and lately letters from his sister had painted a declining picture of the Todoroki household, and it wasn't good to start with. But Kigo never thought it'd involve his mother like this. Before he could say anything, Tuya continued. "He sent her away to a hospital." He let out a dry laugh. "He really just throws out anyone in his way." Izuku shifted uncomfortably, clearly distressed. The room grew warmer. "Okay, Kigo had to defuse this situation somehow. I'm sorry, will Shoto be alright? He really hoped the answer was yes. Eventually, but now that mom's gone, he can do whatever he wants. Tuya gripped the arms of the chair tightly. Fuyumi and Natsuo can't do anything, Shoto's on his own. He looked desperate. Kigo frowned. You can tell Fuyumi to? No, you don't understand, it isn't enough. His face twisted in anger. I need to get of this place. I don't want to be a hero, not when there are heroes like him, that drive their wives to madness. He was shaking in absolute fury, to dumping boiling water on their child's face. Tuya froze, and Izuku inhaled sharply. The younger boy instinctively touched his blind eye, though he maintained his usual detached expression. Kigo could see all of the rage vanish off of Tuya's face, replaced by regret and gentle concern. I'm sorry, Izuku, I didn't mean to say that. It's okay, but, he paused, his head tilting to the side, aren't you already a hero? Huh. Tuya frowned in confusion. Izuku went on, you are very strong and always help me without expecting things in return. His voice trailed off in uncertainty. Damn. This kid was such a mix of trauma and innocence it made his head spin. Tuya, eyebrows raised, responded slowly, I'm still figuring out what it means to be a hero, but, he smiled softly, in the meantime, I'll do my best to live up to that definition. The tension had dissipated, and, thankfully, the room started to cool. Kigo looked over at Izuku, who had already returned to his notebook and was now sketching little diagrams of feathers. Tuya, still calming down, had turned on the TV mounted in the corner and was distracting himself by flipping through the channels. There wasn't much to choose from, and he settled on a local news broadcast. Breathing a sigh of relief, Kigo let himself relax. Crisis averted for now. Sometimes life goes in an unexpected direction. Katsuki. He's going to be here in 20 minutes. Is the room ready? His mother shouted from downstairs. Yes. Of course it is, Hag. It's been ready for days. He stared at the soon-to-be not empty guest room, barely able to wrap his mind around the current situation. 5 years. 5 fucking years since he'd seen Deku, and now he was moving in across the hall? This was insane. So much had changed. Katsuki touched one of his hearing aids, wondering briefly what he'd think, before dismissing the idea. Wasn't Deku half-blind now anyway? He wouldn't care. God, this was all ridiculous. Since Deku had been taken, was that the right word, by the Hero Commission, his mother had visited him sporadically. She'd asked Katsuki if he'd wanted to join her, but how could he look him in the face after everything that had happened? He never did. Eventually, with the help of some underground hero, Eraserface, she managed to get partial custody of Deku, and for 5 nights a week he'd be living with them. His mother would not shut up about how Katsuki was not supposed to ask about his scars, eye or hair. Apparently it was part white. It pissed him off that she thought he'd be that rude. But regardless, it wasn't like Katsuki gave a shit about any of that anyway. Not when Deku had a quirk. Walking by Deku's apartment building, Katsuki was shocked. Construction had hardly started, and the scene was effectively untouched. It looked like an earthquake had leveled the block. Vast trails of ash streaked across the outside of the ruined complex, and the street was a torn-up sea of cracked pavement. His mom had told him not to go, but obviously Katsuki couldn't help himself. It had been on the news, violent quirk manifestation levels apartment building, but he still didn't believe it. Not when Deku never went back to school. Not when they went to Auntie Inko's funeral. Not even when his father sat him down and told him with complete certainty that Deku had a crazy strong quirk now. Katsuki just had to see for himself. But, looking at the wreckage, he wasn't thinking about Deku's power. All he felt was a deep, terrible regret. Katsuki, get down here. I swear to God, did you turn your hearing aids off? He blinked, realizing he'd totally zoned out. Quit it. I'll be right there. The doorbell rang. Running down the stairs, he arrived just in time to see his mother open the door. Deku looked completely different. Not just appearance-wise, he'd expected that. No, his expression was so unbothered. It hit him all at once. The Deku who'd run away crying that day at the park was long gone, and the boy in front of him? He didn't know him at all. Hey Kaken. Long time no see. Katsuki froze. trying desperately to form some sort of coherent response. He should say his real name, right? How could he call him Deku after all this time? After all he did? Why Izuku? It's been a while. What the fuck was wrong with him? God, that sounded so dumb. Raising his eyebrows, Deku looked almost amused at Katsuki's train wreck of a greeting, but he didn't comment on it. Izuku, it's so good to see you. His mother smiled warmly, though her face darkened slightly as a woman with black hair stepped out from behind him. Hello, Bakuga-san. If you have a moment, we need to discuss his schedule. Sure. Her lips pressed together in annoyance. Katsuki, why don't you show Izuku to his room? Right, sure. Jesus Christ. Deku stepped forward and behind him floated two mid-sized black duffels, both glowing a faint green. Guess he didn't need help with his bags. Katsuki continued, it's this way, lamely gesturing towards the stairs before turning in their direction. Thank you for the hospitality, Auntie. Deku bowed his head, before following Katsuki out of the room. The stairwell and subsequent hallway were narrow, but Deku had no trouble manipulating the duffels. In fact, he was seemingly paying them no mind, instead opting to make Katsuki as uncomfortable as possible in the form of small talk. Wow, everything is just like I remember. Deku stood outside the guest's room, marveling at his surroundings. Yeah, for fashion designers my parents don't like redecorating. He winced at his own shitty attempt at humor. The other boy nodded and stepped inside the room, setting the duffels down next to the bed. Late afternoon sun poured through the window, and as the initial shock mostly vanished, Katsuki examined him again. Deku's left eye was a little unnerving, what with the angry, red scar cutting across it, the milky green iris, and lack of a pupil. It made him feel sick. It was his fault. The white hair was strange, but his green roots almost made it look like a stylistic choice instead of a side effect of quirk usage. Of course, the pale, yellow Hawks hoodie hanging off of him betrayed that particular theory. Hawks was some up-and-coming hero, maybe Deku was a fan. He looked a little tired and was absent-mindedly touching his wrists, which were wrapped in some weird black bandages. Katsuki frowned. What the hell were those? Deku noticed the shift in his expression and raised his arms. The sleeves of his sweatshirt fell away to reveal metallic-looking wraps spanning from his palm to mid-forearm. These are quirk suppressants? He glanced away. So you don't have to worry about anything? He blinked. Worry about anything? And he was on suppressants right now? One of the duffels glowed green again, and a small case levitated out and into Deku's hand. If something happens though, these are stronger ones. He opened the case to reveal a set of syringes. If something happens? What the hell are you talking about? Crap. Katsuki hadn't meant to say it like that, but he was just so confused. Deku closed the case and floated it onto the nightstand. Sometimes I have flare-ups. He paused, frowning slightly, and my quirk becomes difficult to control. Katsuki had only ever heard of quirk suppressants being used in places like hospitals and prisons, never to help a person manage their quirk. But also shouldn't they, like, suppress quirks? Why could Deku use his? And from what he'd seen, he had fairly good control. This was all so weird, but before Katsuki could think to say anything, Deku continued. If I have one, it will be during the night. But I'm always on enough suppressants here I won't be able to do much, and once I get the injection, everything will be fine. He tugged his sleeves back down, nearly covering both his hands, bandages and all, so, like I said, you don't have anything to worry about. I'm not. He scowled at his feet, his face growing flushed. I'm not fucking freaked out or anything. Damn it, why was Deku making this so hard? Did seriously he think Katsuki was such a weakling that he had to reassure him or some shit? It pissed him off. He took a deep breath. He needed to calm down. Looking up, Katsuki saw that Deku was staring at him, brows raised. What? He snapped. The other boy briefly examined him, like he was trying to decipher his reaction. Nothing. A moment of silence followed, but before either of the two could speak, there was a shout from downstairs. Boys, if you could please come down, Agent Arakawa is leaving. So that was the woman's name. Katsuki wondered why his mother seemingly disliked her so much as he and Deku made their way back to the front door. Agent Arakawa turned to address Deku. After school tomorrow? You should return here. Immediately, a car will be waiting to drive you to the facility. He nodded and she went on, same on Wednesday, and make sure to have a bag packed for Friday. Deku nodded again, though he seemed far more interested in studying the decor of the living room. Is that all? His mother cut in sharply. The dark-haired woman narrowed her eyes in annoyance and continued, Izuku, are your syringes easily accessible? Yes, he answered and made no attempt to stifle a yawn that followed. Good. Inform Dr. Kuroda if you have to use one. Agent Urakawa paused, that is all. She proceeded to see herself out. His mother, looking quite happy the woman was gone, turned to the two boys. Who's ready for dinner? This was going to be awkward as hell. Edit. My awesome sister made an edit of Izuku, so here's roughly what he looks like. He's technically a little younger. Izuku understood. My Tumblr is at YoungRind, and I'll post any fan art sent to me at the start of chapters. I am not particularly active on Tumblr, so if I don't respond right away, you can comment on the latest chapter and I'll notice for sure. Okay, enjoy the chapter. Izuku had not slept well. First days of school are stressful enough when you aren't a transfer student who looks like they just fell out of a horror movie, or alternatively, have at least gone to a real school in the past half-decade. Mostly though, he had been afraid of having a nightmare. Wearing the suppressant wraps 24/7 was already starting to exhaust him. Izuku would have basically been a walking vegetable if he had injected himself last night. It was technically one of the conditions of his new arrangement, but Dr. Kuroda had been fairly consistent in regularly upping his doses of suppressants for years, so he had been expecting something like this eventually. The wraps dampened the annoying, subconscious effects of his quirk, but they also destabilized it. Essentially, his control was worse, but he could do less damage. Despite that, and the headaches and chills, it was a trade-off Izuku was willing to make, not that he had a choice, in order to avoid a total flare-up anywhere near the Bakugas. The Bakugas. Izuku had seen Auntie Mitsuki a few times a year, the last couple with Uncle Masaru, but now that he'd finally seen Kaken after so long, he didn't know how to feel. The hearing aids were kind of surprising, but it wasn't like Izuku had any right to judge. Besides, he had been considering learning sign language for a while, now he had all the more reason to. As to his general first impression, Kaken had certainly matured, which he guessed was to be expected, but calling him Izuku? That was a shock. His name sounded so foreign coming out of Kaken's mouth, even if the switch did make sense. If nothing else, Izuku definitely wasn't useless anymore. At first he reflexively levitated his backpack, but the subsequent headache reminded him to avoid pushing through the suppressants when he wasn't specifically instructed to. So, Izuku slung it over his shoulder and stepped into the hallway. He found himself face to face with Kaken, who immediately looked away. Come on. I don't want to be late. He grumbled, furrowing his brow. Izuku noted the obvious, didn't you also just finish getting ready? Kaken's head snapped up and his face reddened, but he didn't respond. Beginning to make his way downstairs, Izuku was hit with a wave of nostalgia. The sound of Auntie Mitsuki cooking in the kitchen, it reminded him of a simpler life. He pushed the memories away, thinking about those days never helped anything. And the last thing Izuku needed right now was extra stress. This is Midoriya Izuku. He will be transferring into the class today. The teacher, a plain-looking middle-aged man, turned to Izuku. Bowing his head, Izuku addressed the room, nice to meet you all. For better or for worse, Kaken wasn't in his class, so he had the chance to make a good first impression, not that he planned on making friends. Being a social pariah would merely be an inconvenience. A boy near the back raised his hand. What's your quirk? That was an easy question. My quirk is called matter control. It allows me to manipulate molecules, so I can pull and push objects towards me, as well as manipulate their heat. A buzz of excited chatter overtook the room, the initial shock at his unusual appearance morphing into awe at his impressive-sounding quirk. It was only natural. Assuming there are no other questions, Midoriya, you may take your seat. Izuku nodded and headed over to his desk. It was the leftmost one in the front row, likely courtesy of being half-blind, not that such accommodations were really necessary. The only significant drawbacks were decreased peripheral vision and a lack of distance perception, both of which were mostly compensated for by his quirk. The teacher started speaking, and Izuku immediately began to take notes, a floating pencil dancing across his page leaving a font-like script. He felt the stares of his classmates and remembered that writing via telekinesis was, in fact, uncommon. Whatever, Izuku couldn't really do anything about it. His hands had lasting damage from the burns from that day, so they would cramp up if he wrote for more than an hour. Besides, Dr. Kuroda had instructed him to only write using his quirk about a year into training to develop his precision, which had worked. The drawback was the lack of practice weakened his muscles, resulting in more frequent spasms and leaving his actual handwriting almost unreadable. As the class dragged on, Izuku's head started to throb. The suppressants were really taking their toll. Thankfully, he basically only had to concentrate on writing, as the material was relatively simple compared to the rigorous tutoring he'd been through. There was a sudden clang, as a girl a few seats away knocked over her bottle of water. Without even looking in her direction, Izuku simultaneously suspended the liquid in the air and lifted the bottle, proceeding to funnel every last drop back in, before setting it back on the desk and screwing on the cap for good measure. Izuku stopped taking notes. The room had gone completely quiet, even the teacher was staring at him slack-jawed. At that moment, the lunch bell rang, and for a second, no one moved. Then, the girl was the first to speak. "Thank you," she stammered. With the tension having been dissipated, everyone began to get up. The silence gave way to scattered conversation. That was insane. A quirk like that, don't want to get on his bad side? He could probably beat Bakugo, you know. The thought of fighting anyone here, especially Kaken, made his blood run cold. These students, he wasn't like them at all. He hadn't been for a long time. Izuku avoided looking at anyone while he packed his bag. Dr. Kuroda had been right, this was a mistake. Katsuki was not in a good mood. At lunch, Deku was the talk of the entire school. He'd levitated some drink in class or something, and apparently that was, like, the news of the century. All these fucking extras were freaking out and spreading baseless rumors. Saying shit like he got expelled from his last school for fighting or that the scars on his face were from a villain attack, which was actually the truth, not that they would know. Seeing Deku eat alone, approached every few minutes or so by groups of dumbasses, hungry for a glimpse of the fabled transfer student, Katsuki had almost considered inviting him to sit at his table. But why would he ever want to sit with him, should he? The nerd clearly could take care of himself. The last period had just ended, and Katsuki was ready to go home. He obviously had to walk back with Deku, which seemed worse than walking to school this morning had been, as, if nothing else, the shitty day had served as a reminder of just how insane the situation was. All this stuff about that transfer student, Midoriya, is totally crazy. He glanced up to see Tsubasa, one of the idiots who'd attached themselves to Katsuki over the years. The boy's leathery wings shifted slightly and his eyes narrowed as he continued. His name, though, is he that wimp from elementary school? Katsuki stiffened. Damn it, how was he supposed to respond? Tsubasa, lost in thought, interrupted. What did you call him? It meant useless, right? No. Angered coursed through him. If Katsuki was trying so hard not to say that awful old nickname, he sure as hell didn't want anyone else saying it. And so casually too, it pissed him the fuck off. I called him Deku. He snapped and then froze. Deku was standing at the door to the classroom, waiting for him. He'd heard him. Why was he like this? Just shut the hell up. Katsuki mumbled and stormed out. As they walked, he avoided looking at Deku, who had fallen into stride next to him. Why wasn't he saying anything? Neither of them attempted to speak for a while, but eventually Katsuki couldn't take it anymore. He halted abruptly. Say something. Deku stopped and turned to face him. What? His face was completely expressionless. Looking down at his feet, Katsuki went on shakily, Why aren't you getting upset? Yelling at me, crying, You hate that name. His vision grew cloudy with tears and he balled his hands into fists. Why are you acting like you don't care? The words seemed to echo across the empty street. After what might as well have been an eternity, Deku spoke. I don't. A wave of memories washed over Katsuki. That's a perfect name for a quirkless piece of trash like you. He smirked at the younger boy while the other kids in the group started to laugh in agreement. Kaken, why would you say that? Deku was crying now. I'm not useless. Please stop calling me that, Deku whispered as he stuffed his notebook in his backpack. Why should I, Deku? It's the truth, isn't it? Katsuki approached him and the boy frantically stepped backwards and fell into a desk, a look of terror overtaking his face. It made him so mad. Why was Deku acting that scared? It wasn't like Katsuki was really going to hurt him. Why was he still following Katsuki around? Everyone else had already gone home for lunch, leaving the two of them alone. You're just a quirkless, useless loser, Deku. Stay the hell out of my way. He had the audacity to look up at him again with those tear-filled eyes. It made Katsuki sick. Kaken, I'm sorry, please. What the hell was he apologizing for? Katsuki just wanted him to shut up, so he shoved him, realizing his quirk activated a second too late. Katsuki stood there in a stunned silence, looking in horror from his smoking hand to the boy's bleeding shoulder. What had he just done? Deku ran out of the park. What the fuck do you mean you don't care? That name doesn't bother me anymore, Deku said plainly. How? Katsuki raised his eyebrows. How could that be? Well, it's like, Deku frowned slightly, I am strong now, so it doesn't hurt because it isn't true. He paused, tilting his head. Being called such an obviously inaccurate nickname, it'd be pointless to get worked up over that, right? At first, Katsuki couldn't answer. Then he asked quietly, what do you want me to call you? Now, it was the other boy's turn to be surprised. Another moment of silence followed. Deku is fine. Katsuki's head shot up, his eyes wide. Are you serious? Yeah. I think it's kind of funny. The ghost of a smile spread across his face. Okay then. Katsuki took a deep breath, like a heavy weight had been lifted off his chest. I guess we should head home now, Deku. The sky was dark by the time Izuku got home that evening. After a quiet dinner at the Bakugu's, Auntie Mitsuki noted his duffels were largely untouched. Katsuki, why don't you help Izuku unpack? She was smiling but clearly not willing to take no for an answer. The blonde boy stifled a yawn and quickly glanced over at him. Fine. He furrowed his brow, though his eyes showed no malice. Hey brat. Wait, did you just actually listen? What? Kaken snapped. Is it that much of a fucking surprise? Language. Auntie Mitsuki paused, her expression softening. But, you two can go now, I'll finish cleaning up. They made their way to the room. It was fairly barren, save for a few random clothes peeking out of one of the bags and the case of syringes strapped to the nightstand. Geez, you really haven't unpacked it all? Izuku just stood there. I was getting around to it. Yeah, sure. Kaken looked back at him. What do you want me to do? It's fine. Izuku walked to his luggage. You can leave. Bullshit. I said I'd help. He followed him over, crouching down next to the open duffel. Is this one all clothes? Basically. The bag and nearby dresser glowed green. The drawers opened and neatly folded piles of clothing floated in. Huh? If it's so easy, why the hell am I even here? He just shrugged. You insisted? Tisk. Kaken directed his attention towards the other bag. What's in that one? Notebooks, mostly, Izuku answered, putting away the last of the garments. His headache, which had subsided during dinner, was starting to return, and he decided to unpack the next one by hand. Izuku manually unzipped the bag and a wave of familiarity rushed over him. He began to unload the contents onto an empty shelf on the other side of the room. Kaken didn't comment on the switch and simply started to assist. They worked quietly for a bit before Izuku felt a sharp pain in his right hand. He dropped all the books on the floor and swayed slightly, black spots dancing before his eyes. Fuck, are you okay? Kaken rushed over, looking concerned. That was new. I'm fine. His eyes narrowed. You don't look fine. I'm tired, that's all. Izuku absent-mindedly massaged his hand and began to kneel down to pick up the fallen items. Ugh, he immediately dismissed him. Go sit down. I'll do it. Izuku debated protesting but decided it wasn't worth it and sat down on the bed. Most of the bag was already unpacked after all. I haven't seen this picture in such a long time. His head snapped up. The other boy was holding a booklet of 2 photos. looking at the image showing the two of them smiling widely in front of their mothers. He mentally kicked himself for letting that fall on the ground and had to resist immediately pulling it towards him. "You can just give it to me." His face reddened. "Sorry?" Kaken handed the booklet over, slightly frowning as he inadvertently glanced at the other side. He did not recognize that one. "You've got it." Levitating a small orb of emerald flame in front of his chest, Izuku let out the tiniest smile. "Now pass it back to me." Tuya bent his arms in preparation. He took a deep breath and flung the ball. The red-haired boy dissipated it with a blast of blue flame, but Izuku instantly drew the blaze back to him in an even larger sphere of fire. "Yes." Tuya pumped his fist in the air. "Fire catches a success." "Calm down with all the burning. My feathers are going to melt," Kigo shouted from nearby. He stuck out his tongue. "You're just jealous." They continued the game for a little while until Tuya's face grew flushed. Sorry Izuku, I think I have to take a break." He wiped away the beads of sweat forming on his forehead. Izuku nodded, proceeding to release all the flames. As Tuya went to take a seat on the side of the training room, he called out, "You two play a game now." Kigo drew all his feathers back into his wings and appeared before Izuku in the blink of an eye. He placed his on chin. "Oh, do you want to fly with me?" "I can only levitate," Izuku frowned. "I don't think that qualifies." "Of course it does. Besides, you won't get better without practice." "All right." He'd gotten much better at telekinetically controlling himself and rose up into the air without difficulty. Though moving horizontally was another matter entirely. Instantly, Kigo was by his side, taking hold of his sleeve. "Here, I'll guide you like this." He gently tugged and the two drifted off to the right. "Whoa!" Tuya yelled from below. "That's so cool, Izuku." "Hey, what about me?" The blonde boy pouted. "But you're just there." The group was interrupted by the entrance of Mori-sensei. "Wow boys, that's impressive." The man motioned them down. "Unfortunately, free time is over." Izuku and Kigo began their relative descents, but Tuya had other plans. "Wait, Mori-sensei, could you take a picture of the three of us? I want one to send to Fuyumi." He raised his eyebrows at the request but nodded in agreement. "Thank you." The boy bowed his head, then looked up. "Let's pose." "Izuku, can you float a little higher?" "And Kigo, go under him to the left." Tuya then jogged into position to the right. "Okay, Izuku, let's release some flame." Both of them ignited and the room was illuminated in a turquoise glow. "Awesome." Mori-sensei readied his phone. "Ready? 1, 2, 3. Izuku snapped back to reality as he grabbed onto the booklet. He pulled out the photo on the right and read the note on the back. "Izuku, Kigo, and Tuya, the flying flame heroes." For a moment, he basked in the comfort of the inscription before proceeding to slip the picture back in place. "Ooh!" Kaken stopped himself. "Shit, sorry, never mind. It's okay, the three of us trained together." He paused. "The blonde one is Kigo, but you'd know him as Hawks." Kaken's eyes widened at that, but he just nodded, clearly not expecting the explanation. Izuku hadn't expected it either. The exhaustion must have been making him talkative. "And the red-haired one." He smiled sadly, glancing back at the picture and then away again. "His name was Tuya?" The following weeks turned into months, and Izuku gradually adjusted to the new rhythm of his life. School, training, home, repeat. Living in a house was strange. Even before, he'd never had a functional family life, so Izuku didn't really know how to function in one. To that end, surprisingly, Kaken had been incredibly helpful. From watching pro-hero news coverage with him in the living room to dragging him to the kitchen to help cook meals, Izuku never had the chance to learn and was pitifully awful at it. He really strove to make him feel welcome. Izuku suspected Auntie Mitsuki had something to do with it, but, honestly, it didn't matter. The pair were actually friends now. Objectively speaking, his life was better than it had been in a long time. So, naturally, something, more like someone, had to come along and ruin things. Sitting in Dr. Kuroda's office as the man droned on about testing and training plans, Izuku was completely zoned out. "So we'll be trying the collar out again today." His stomach dropped. That certainly got his attention. With all the resistance training you've been doing with the wraps, you should be able to handle it better. Dr. Kuroda smiled coldly. For the foreseeable future, we'll be focusing on building your tolerance. Protesting was futile. Izuku knew that much. So he just nodded as the panic set in, and, upon instruction, proceeded to the testing site. Fluorescent lighting illuminated the room's reinforced walls, ceiling, and floor, as well as the chair in the center, which allowed Dr. Kuroda to run all experiments from behind a thick one-way mirror. It had built-in capabilities so that no one had to endanger themselves trying to manually inject Izuku if anything went wrong. Part of him was thankful for that. Most of him just really didn't want to put that awful thing on. Regardless, within moments, he was being strapped in at the wrists, ankles, and waist with woven, metallic bands, tightly enough to leave bruising, so he wouldn't accidentally shift out of range of the automated syringes. Then it was time. A heavy, steel collar, its interior lined with tungsten needles, was locked around his neck, and then all staff left the room. The puncture wounds stung. "All right, we're going to turn it on now. Try to use your quirk." Dr. Kuroda's voice blared through the speakers, tinged with excitement. There was a whirring sound as the needles started to vibrate, emitting a frequency that disrupted the expression of his quirk factor. His head exploded in excruciating pain and his vision blurred. Ice water seemed to course through his veins as small bursts of flame sporadically flashed around him, only to vanish immediately. Everything felt wrong and slow, and it all hurt so much. Izuku concentrated on increasing the entropy of his own matter. This, as Dr. Kuroda had explained, created a destructive interference and cancelled out the collar's signal. It was a perfect ability for counteracting quirk-suppressing technology, or alternatively, for testing and developing it. After what might as well have been an eternity, Izuku managed to raise his body temperature high enough and ignited his surroundings in a hot, viridescent blaze. He clung onto the soothing inferno, cherishing the familiar hum of his own combustion. But Izuku could only override the frequency in short bursts. After an instant, the fire dissipated and the cold returned. Too tired to resist this time, he succumbed to the frigid darkness, losing consciousness so quickly he didn't fully catch the doctor's response to his flames. Izuku really hoped his performance was satisfactory. "Are you sure you don't want anything to eat?" Auntie Mitsuki's voice was far softer than usual, but to Izuku's migraine it might as well have been gunfire. He was just so tired. "Izuku!" Meeting her gaze, Izuku was almost surprised by the concern in her eyes. Simply put, it wasn't a look he was familiar with. "Yes, sorry." His hands started to shake, and he stuffed them into his pockets. "I'm just not hungry." Kaken was frowning and looked like he wanted to say something, but Izuku ignored him. He'd fall asleep right there if this conversation lasted any longer. Luckily, Auntie Mitsuki relented. "All right," she was frowning now as well. "Try and get some rest then. If you want anything later, don't hesitate to ask, okay?" Izuku nodded slowly and made his way to his room. He was out as soon as his head hit the pillow. Unfortunately, or rather, inevitably after the day's training, it was going to be one of those nights. At first, all Izuku could see was fire. Burning emerald flames shrouded a figure before him. He went to put out the blaze, but stopped, frozen in terror. The person was laughing. "Izuku," it crooned before breaking back into the demented howls. He couldn't breathe. "You really think you can get away from me so easily?" No. This wasn't real. He is dead, I killed him," the words echoed in his head. "Ikilledhm. His father wouldn't stop. Yuri less than a worthless disgrace now." His heart pounded in his chest as the conflagration spread and consumed them both. Still, his voice, loud as thunder, echoed over the fire's roar. "All that power and you didn't even save your own moth air." Faster and faster and faster and faster. Izuku needed to burn it all away. He didn't care if his skin melted off. "You let her die." His vision went white as the bone-chilling laughter reverberated throughout the space. Then it turned into a deafening scream. Wails of pain stabbed at Izuku's ears, and as his vision cleared he realized he was in a training room. The stench of burnt flesh filled the air. Tuya was thrashing about within a cobalt inferno. There were staff around him gaping in horror, It was too hot for them to even begin to approach the boy. Izuku ripped off the flames as fast as he could. In his desperation, he also extended his telekinetic influence to Tuya himself. Briefly, Izuku saw his aura more clearly than ever before, observing the molecular damage to his skin and muscles. He could feel it. He had done it. He had saved him. So why? The scene shifted. Izuku stood next to Kigo, facing Dr. Kuroda. The man's face was somber as he spoke. I'm sorry to tell you this, but Tuya succumbed to his injuries. His family has been informed. The blond boy just looked at his feet, attempting in vain to hold back the tears streaming down his face. Izuku did not cry. You're lying. The walls hissed as the room burst into an oppressive heat. Wisps of green flame formed around him, and he rose off the floor. Stepping back in surprise, Kigo's eyes widened in shock. He proceeded to collect himself and quickly jumped into action. Izuku, please try to calm down. Where is he? He screamed, anger and frustration boiling within him. Let me see him. A red light had started to flash in the room. The doctor must have alerted the containment squad. Izuku couldn't care less, practically vibrating with rage. His flames were only twisting faster and faster as cracks radiated through every possible inanimate surface. He was interrupted by heavy weight on both his shoulders, followed by a sharp tug. Hitting the ground hard, Izuku looked up just in time to witness one of the containers, dressed in thick fireproof clothing, roughly lift up his head. Another jammed something around his throat. First, there was an icy, stinging sensation. Then, he heard a quiet whirring sound. In an instant, a blinding agony tore through him. It was like his organs had been individually frozen and wedged back inside his body. He suffocated in the darkness, desperately trying to force the tiniest breath of air into his practically solid lungs. Panicking now, Izuku felt his awareness slipping away. And oh, he couldn't pass out. Tuya wasn't dead. Where was he? Izuku's eyes snapped open, and he looked down to see Kaken bathed in a green glow. Are you okay? The boy asked, his eyes darting nervously around the room as the various objects surged into the air. Gasping and shaking, he managed to gesture towards the suppressants, which were thankfully still safely secured on the nightstand. Syringe. Kaken immediately dashed over and unstrapped the case. Removing one of the doses, he started handing it over. Izuku shook his head and pulled up his sleeve. His heart was pounding in his ears, and the room was getting hotter by the second. The state he was in, he'd surely miss. Pausing for a moment, Kaken nodded and climbed onto the bed. The apprehension had mostly vanished from his face, leaving behind a concentrated determination. Having discussed the procedure in the past, he immediately stuck the needle in, released the solution, and jumped off the side to avoid a collision as Izuku fell. At once, the room cooled rapidly, and everything that had been swirling around dropped to the ground. Thank you, he managed, shivering as the cold overtook him. Kaken just nodded. Do you want to go watch TV? He glanced down, placing the empty syringe in the designated portion of the case, before continuing, it's just after 5, and I'd understand if you don't feel like going back to sleep. Izuku took a deep breath and pulled up his hood. He felt so sick, but he really didn't want to be alone right now. Okay. Katsuki was fucking freaked out. His mom had found the two in the living room just before 7, and after hearing what had happened, and seeing Deku, declared they both had the day off of school. That had never happened before, but he was far too shaken by the night's events to care. He awoke to a banging and crashing from across the hall. Deku had mentioned having nightmares before, but Katsuki had never seen anything more than the aftereffects. Mornings when the boy had dark bags around his eyes and monosyllabic vocabulary. Rushing out, he heard Deku crying out for a Tuya, the kid from that photo. He was dead, wasn't he? There wasn't much time to think about it. Katsuki had to act quickly, and he did. But something felt so wrong about it all. Deku just looked so hurt. The mid-morning sun streamed in through the window as the TV blared random news stories. It was around 11 now, but Deku had barely said anything at all, like he was in a goddamn trance or something. Seriously, his face was completely blank, and the only sign of any responsiveness was his perpetual shivering. It was unnerving as hell. As Katsuki was debating bringing the untouched bowl of soup on the coffee table back into the kitchen, the doorbell rang. Right away, he worried it was that shitty agent and stormed over, ready to give her a piece of his mind. Deku needed a fucking break from those assholes. He ripped open the door and his jaw dropped. "Kigo?" Deku called faintly from the couch. "Hawks. Hey Izuku, thought I'd finally come visit." He turned to Katsuki. "So, this is the famous Kaken?" His face went beet red. "No, yes, damn it," he fumbled. "Just, call me Katsuki." Fuck. Why did he have to call him that childish nickname? "Oh, Takami, you got here so quickly." His mom was making her way down the stairs and her tone shifted harshly. "Katsuki, you going to let him in?" Katsuki realized they were both still standing at the threshold. He looked askance. "Please come in." His mother, having switched back to her hospitable mode, turned to Hawks. "Can I get you some tea?" "That sounds great, thank you." She nodded and went to prepare it. "I didn't know you were coming." Deku rasped, letting the blanket he'd cocooned himself in fall just past his shoulders. It was a little touch and go for a while. Hawks sat next to him on the couch and smirked playfully. "I didn't want to get your hopes up." "Sure." They all got settled, and though Deku still was pretty out of it, Katsuki was surprised by how much more relaxed he seemed. A few minutes later, his mother returned with the tea and then headed back upstairs. After he finished it, Katsuki, determined to prove that he was, in fact, a good host, offered to put away the cup. He grabbed the pitiful uneaten soup too. Walking back into the room, Deku and Hawks were talking. "You had to overload it before they took it off?" Hawks frowned in disbelief. Deku nodded slowly, rubbing a weird-looking scar on his neck. Katsuki had noticed and honestly tried not to think about the faint puncture marks that lined it, but now the area looked all inflamed. His stomach turned when the boy's sleeve fell away to reveal dark, purple bruising around his wrist. What the fuck happened to Deku? And what was it? Noticing Katsuki's re-entrance, he drew his hand away and pulled the blanket back up. The conversation was clearly over. Over the next hour or so, Deku got progressively more tired, finally succumbing to exhaustion and passing out on Hawk's shoulder. Katsuki was shocked to say the least. He usually couldn't get closer than a few feet to another person before looking like he wanted to jump out of his skin. It must have been a rough night. "He needed a syringe, right?" Hawks asked quietly. "Yeah," he hesitated, wanting to ask about whatever the hell had torn up Deku's neck, but he had a feeling that wasn't information Hawks would be forthcoming with. So, Katsuki opted to ask the other question on his mind. "Does he usually have nightmares that bad?" Frowning, Hawks glanced back at Deku. "Isn't out of the ordinary." His reaction was just more extreme because his quirk was destabilized and he wasn't on any suppressants. That made Katsuki feel sick, but there was something else bothering him. Deku was calling out for Tuya. He bit his lip. Did he see him die? Hawk's face darkened. "For all intents and purposes, yes." He sighed. "He's seen a lot, too much." Looking at Deku now, he seemed so peaceful. It was hard to imagine just what sort of life he'd led. Well, continued to lead. "Continuing," Hawks confessed. "I'll be honest, I was nervous about how the two of you would get along. Izuku can be pretty closed off, and with your history..." Well, he paused, then broke into a slight grin. "But it doesn't seem like I had anything to worry about." Katsuki just scowled and looked away. What the hell was he supposed to say that anyway? Besides, when it comes to Deku there was always shit to worry about. Yagi Toshinori was not having a good day. He was technically off duty, though a hero never really is, and had spent the better part of the afternoon running various errands throughout Mizudafu. To say there was a lot on his mind would be an understatement. From the stress of his powers waning to the mounting pressure to choose a successor, Toshinori had never felt farther from his hero persona, All Might. Perhaps Mirai was right all those years ago, but he just couldn't let go. His thoughts were interrupted by shouts of pain. A villain attack? Toshinori activated his muscle form and rushed to the source of the commotion, a secluded tunnel tucked away beneath a bridge. The space was illuminated in a green light, and hundreds of drops of slime hung in the air. "Please, put me back." Anguished whines echoed throughout the space. "I didn't know." What was going on? An annoyed sigh followed and he turned to see a child? The boy was wearing a middle school uniform and had a concerning scar over one of his eyes. Much to Toshinori's surprise, his expression seemed bored, almost annoyed. It shifted though, morphing into one of mild surprise as he turned towards him. "Oh, All Might." He bowed his head. "Nice to meet you. Let me go. I'll leave, I swear. I won't bother anyone. Can you stop making so much noise?" The boy said flatly, rubbing his temples before continuing to address Toshinori. "Could I please use one of those sodas?" He just nodded in disbelief and went to reach for a 1-liter bottle in his bag. "It's all right, I've got it." A drink flew out and rushed to a floating position a few feet from the boy. Instantly, the cap screwed off and its contents spilled onto the ground. The globs of slime began to steam as they picked up speed and proceeded to flow in. The screams of agony were muffled as the bottle was resealed. "Would you be able to take this to the police? I have to get home." He looked at Toshinori as the contained villain drifted over. Yes," he managed and cleared his throat. "It would be my pleasure." Toshinori picked up the villain and by the time it was secured, the boy was gone. Who was he? Did today's youth really possess such power? He hadn't even gotten his name. Izuku could not believe it. He was walking into Dr. Kuroda's office, but his mind was replaying the afternoon's events over and over. Kaken had left school early for a doctor's appointment. Auntie Mitsuki scheduled it in the early afternoon as she made a point of being home whenever he got back from training. Well, regardless of the reason, he was walking back by himself. Something felt off the moment Izuku entered the tunnel, and immediately, a deranged voice called out to him. A medium-sized body, to hide in. Slime surged towards him, but he was unfazed, pushing the individual globs away and suspending them in the air. Though the goop was technically biological matter, its strange composition and natural liquid state left it less sensitive to dramatic increases in temperature, and thus a viable target of such manipulation. The villain screamed for mercy, but Izuku could not be bothered. Honestly, he was so weak, no wonder he targeted a defenseless middle school student. Hearing footsteps, he turned to the entrance, ready to reassure a random civilian that the situation was under control. Instead, his eyes met an almost completely solid aura, the densest he'd ever seen. Izuku was face to face with All Might? He had met many pro-heroes before, though most of them weren't that widely known. The Hero Commission was careful about keeping him out of the public eye, so any hero they wanted him to train with had to possess a certain level of discretion. But this was different. It wasn't like Izuku had ever been an obsessive fan of his, or any hero for that matter, but All Might's quirk had fascinated him for some time. Additionally, and more importantly, the man was the epitome of everything a hero should be, everything he was supposed to be. Seeing him up close was sort of overwhelming. But of course, as Izuku began to speak, his tone remained relatively unbothered. Fear, anger, pressure, stress, he was pretty used to it all. The interaction hadn't ended up being all that remarkable. Izuku had had it under control, and All Might had just let him finish apprehending the villain. It was objectively a strange sight, so the hero's shock was to be expected. There was just one thing. Izuku could have sworn he saw his aura flicker. "Izuku!" He blinked. "Yes?" Dr. Kuroda sighed. "I said, your part-time residence with the Bakugas has yet to noticeably hinder your progress, so you will be allowed to continue this arrangement." Izuku felt his shoulders relax. He'd been desperately hoping to hear those words. "Regarding your schooling, the Hero Commission has determined the program at UA to be satisfactory, and you have been recommended for admission." He leaned back in his chair. "Of course, upon attendance, you will still continue your regular training schedule." Kaken would be pleased. He didn't really talk about it, but Izuku knew he wanted to go there. Also, there definitely would be a surplus of interesting quirks to document. So, he wasn't really averse to going to UA. Though, he was annoyed at the doctor's insistence he would continue training. It was so unnecessarily patronizing. Of course they weren't just going to let him stop. However, Izuku held his tongue and nodded, lifting his eyebrows slightly to convey his understanding. Smile. Shut up when you know it's good for you. All those lessons had been drilled into him for years. Besides, Getting upset always means someone gets hurt. And you don't want to hurt anyone else, do you, Izuku? He blinked again, and the doctor continued, eyes glittering coldly. Additionally, there is a recommendations exam, a formality naturally, but I trust you will showcase your skills to our satisfaction. As if there was any other option. Having just barged into the house with Deku, the shitty agent woman was already pissing Katsuki off. Izuku has been authorized to continue this living arrangement, so long as certain conditions are met, she said monotonously. His mother snarled her response, I was not informed it was up for reauthorization. I do not report to you. This conversation was already starting to take too long, and Katsuki wanted to find out what the damn conditions were, though he'd like to see them fucking try and take him away again. As the back and forth continued, Deku caught his attention and started signing. Do you want to go upstairs? That was unexpected. Usually the other boy seemed perfectly content standing as the two went at it, but Katsuki wasn't complaining. Hopefully Deku would explain it all himself. He left the room, Deku following suit behind him. Walking into his room, Katsuki was the first to speak. What is she talking about? I'm going to you. Deku answered plainly. Katsuki's eyes widened. He definitely hadn't been secretly hoping for that or anything. He ultimately failed to contain his excitement. That's great, we can train together to prepare for the exam. Deku had the nerve to visibly recoil at the suggestion, glancing away as he spoke. I don't think that's a good idea. Besides, I'm taking the recommendations exam anyway. He furrowed his brow. Who cares? An exam's an exam. I said no. His voice was sharp. The room got a bit warmer, and Katsuki could feel his palms starting to sweat, but he was too pissed to care. Why was Deku being so dismissive? He turned to leave. I'm done talking about this. Stop looking down on me. Katsuki slammed his arms down in frustration, releasing bursts of explosions downwards, igniting the rug. He froze in horror. Without hesitation, Deku spun back around and dissipated the flames. He looked down at the smoldering carpet. Sorry. That was my fault. I raised the temperature. His face twisted in frustration. But this is what I mean. Fucking stop, Katsuki interrupted. I set the carpet on fire. Don't try and take credit for it. He looked straight at Deku. I'm not scared of you. It was the truth. Katsuki had never been afraid of him. Not standing by the ruins of that apartment complex or rushing into his room when he had nightmares. Not once. The other boy didn't respond. Katsuki continued, those Hero Commission assholes just tricked you into thinking you're some weapon of mass destruction, but you're not. He took a deep breath. You're just Deku, okay? Deku's eyebrows curved upwards as he stared at Katsuki, his mouth slightly agape. After what seemed to be hours, he broke the silence. Fine, he pressed his lips together. I'm really not supposed to, but if it's in a secluded place, I guess we could practice. Deku paused, absent-mindedly rubbing his hands, but I'll take the necessary precautions, and we're done at the first sign of trouble. All right, Katsuki grinned, you're lucky you're taking the nerd exam, because I'm totally beating all the extras at the regular one. Amused by his response, a small smile spread across Deku's face. You really shouldn't call people extras, Kaken. Shoto. You need to take this seriously. I will not tolerate. Shoto just stormed out of the car, slamming the door behind him. They were at you already. What else needed to be said? Of course he had to pester him like this, today of all days. Following the signs leading to the exam, Shoto's mind wandered. Not using his left side. It was a dangerous plan. He'd undoubtedly get screamed at, forced into extra training sessions. The mere thought made him nauseous, but the satisfaction would be worth it. All he needed to do was win. Opening the door to the waiting room, Shoto noticed Momo was already there. She waved him over, her initial smile morphing into a frown as she saw his, apparently, sour expression. Had a tough drive over, huh? Shoto just looked away. He didn't want to talk about it. In fact, he didn't want to talk about anything, though that had never stopped her before. Oh, no need to be rude. Momo laughed, though her eyes betrayed legitimate concern. Are you ready for the test? What kind of question was that? Of course he was ready. What else could he possibly be? Yes. She just rolled her eyes. Well, it's good to see you're peppy as ever. Glancing over her shoulder, Momo continued, I think that guy over there wants to talk to you. Shoto turned to see some big, excitable guy he remembered from the written exam standing by the entrance. Urashi? Inasa? It didn't matter, he had no intention of socializing. The door opened again, and a boy walked in. He had a slim, yet muscular build, and his white hair with green roots was unusual. Still, he had beat him on the weird hair. Shoto had to resist touching his scar when he saw his eye. Then, an unfamiliar feeling overtook him. Was he angry? Something about the boy seemed, wait, why was he looking at him? Momo, jumping at the chance to force Shoto to be friendly, dragged him over and promptly introduced them both. Hello. I am Yaoyorozu Momo. She gestured at him, and this is Todoroki Shoto. What's your name? The boy, still looking at him, answered, I am Midoriya Izuku. He wore a detached, polite smile. Nice to meet you both. Momo nodded, but her face grew cloudy with confusion. She hesitated before giving in to her curiosity. That's an interesting uniform. Her cheeks flushed. Sorry. I didn't mean to be rude. Midoriya's uniform was quite unusual. In fact, it didn't look like a uniform at all. It was dark gray, high-tech athletic wear with an easily recognizable white, stitched logo. Why was he wearing the Hero Commission insignia? It's fine, Midoriya interrupted, dismissing her concerns. It's more for training. You train at the Hero Commission? Shoto cut in, a little more accusatory than intended. Momo flashed a quick glare at him, before turning back to Midoriya, whose expression had grown even more distant, somehow. Yes. He paused. They're the reason I'm here. What did that mean? And why did it feel like Midoriya wanted to talk with him more? Or maybe it was him who wanted to? In a vain attempt to steer the conversation back onto a more normal path, Momo changed the topic. Are you nervous about the exam? No, he said flatly. Right, the exam. Shoto tried to focus. He couldn't let himself be distracted, especially not by such powerful competition. A Hero Commission trainee? He'd never even heard of such a thing, and if Midoriya's casual demeanor and cavalier attitude towards the test was any indicator, he was the real deal. Meanwhile, Momo looked almost put off by the harsh response. Exams always got her stressed out, illogically he might add, given her quirk and intelligence, so she was extra sensitive at the moment. To his surprise, Midoriya immediately picked up on it. You're going to do fine. He looked around the room. You both are going to pass. What? Her eyes were wide. How do you know? Part of my quirk. Midoriya faced them again. I'm not sure how many people they take, but, besides me, you two and him are the top 3. Of course he was pointing at that annoying guy from before. But, more importantly, what the hell kind of quirk did he have? Premonition? They were interrupted by a piercing shouting. Hi-yi-yi-yi little listeners. Everyone turned to face the source of the disturbance. Present Mike. Are you ready for the exam? Urashi pumped his fist in the air. Yes. He turned to Shoto. Let's all do our best. What a pain. Present Mike looked pleased at the excitement and proceeded to explain the obstacle course, before splitting them into 3s. It shouldn't matter, as overall rank was based purely on timing, but still, why did he have to be paired with Midoriya and Urashi? The tracks spanned the entire gymnasium, consisting of a variety of terrain from urban cityscapes to mountains. Their race was last, so the group waited off to the side. There was a moment of quiet, finally, but Midoriya broke the silence. What's your quirk? He asked Urashi, scanning him over like a puzzle. Urashi looked slightly taken aback by the sudden interrogation, but quickly regained his composure, answering loudly, Oh, it's called Whirlwind. It lets me control the air around me. Interesting, Midoriya tilted his head slightly. Does it require physical motion to activate? Again, Urashi looked surprised, but responded regardless, No, but my power and range go way down. Midoriya paused, before continuing to ask a series of increasingly specific questions. Maybe he had an analytical quirk and was planning on using the boy somehow. Shoto was almost annoyed he wasn't asking him anything. Did he not think it was worth his time? Eventually, the other races were done. Momo had won hers, of course. The 3 of them lined up at the start line, But any curiosity Shoto had about his fellow examinees had all but vanished, as his father looked down on him from the balcony. He glared at the man, his eyes glinting with defiance before he tore them away. Shoto couldn't let himself get too worked up now. Not when there was so much at stake. Shifting his focus to the track ahead, he caught a glimpse of Midoriya. The boy's head was tilted upwards, his face twisted in visible disgust. He'd never seen anyone but Natsuo look at his father like that before. Before Shoto could even begin to process whatever that was about, Present Mike started to count down. 3, 2, stay art. He immediately released a stream of ice, but in the split second before he was launched forward, his field of vision was overtaken by a flash of green. When it cleared, Midoriya was gone, leaving him and Yurashi neck and neck as they pressed on. Did he teleport? What was his quirk? Shoto heard a whizzing sound and looked up to see Midoriya shooting through the air. His stomach dropped, but, for a moment he was more in awe than anything else. Though the reality of his goals crashed quickly back onto his shoulders. As Shoto continued to propel himself onward, hot air currents radiated from above and behind. Thankfully, his ice was more than cold enough to allow him to proceed unhindered. Yurashi was not so lucky, as his wind control seemed to be at odds with whatever Midoriya was doing. As a result, Shoto pulled ahead, not that it really mattered. Midoriya was hurtling diagonally towards the end, having turned sharply and launched himself downwards from the apex of his flight. He watched helplessly from the distance as the boy quickly decelerated, the luminous emerald glow around him fading to a slight shimmer as he landed gracefully on the finish line. Finishing out the race was uneventful. Despite Yurashi picking up speed once Midoriya was done, the distance was too great and Shoto finished first between the two. Second place. Not enough. Shoto started to walk out. He surely got in, at least, and his father was going to have been angry regardless, but not using his left side and losing? Why didn't you use your fire? He whipped around to see Midoriya looking at him, brow furrowed in confusion. Shoto narrowed his eyes. What did you just say? You could have gone much faster since you could have taken advantage of all the heated air, instead of having to overcome it, he frowned. So, why didn't you use it? Well, if this wasn't the exact speech he was going to on the way home. Why was Midoriya so bothered by his quirk usage, anyway? He'd won. It's none of your business. He snapped, a little too harshly. Midoriya just stared at him, his expression shifting from apparent bewilderment to sadness. Suddenly, Shoto felt a wave of guilt. The question was reasonable, and something about the look on Midoriya's face. It seemed so genuine. Shoto looked away in embarrassment, mumbling a quiet, sorry. Most of the other examinees had already begun to filter out. Momo was long gone, her hectic schedule dictated she left right after her race. Aside from a still too enthusiastic Yurashi giving them an impassioned congratulations, as he left, the pair was undisturbed. Not to say everyone wasn't still gaping in awe at Midoriya, they were just doing it from a distance. The other boy seemed completely unfazed, focusing entirely on Shoto for some reason, but the weight of all those eyes was almost boring holes in his back. Shock, amazement, fear. They weren't even directed towards him and he could hardly stand it. Before Shoto could begin to try and excuse himself, seriously, how did he always seem to end up stuck in social situations? Booming footsteps echoed from the hall right outside the gym's entrance. Damn it. His father stormed loudly into the room, which was now completely empty, save for the two of them and Present Mike. This is where your childish rebellion gets you, Shoto. Apparently I have failed to make that clear. He seethed before turning his attention to Midoriya. Now, your performance was quite impressive. His eyes widened as he recognized the logo on his jacket. Hero Commission? He fumbled for his words. You shouldn't be here. Midoriya just shrugged, his gaze devoid of emotion. The decision was made. Suddenly, he looked at Shoto. Do you want to go to get our bags? He was speechless, but the veins beginning to jut out on his father's forehead practically made the decision for him. Sure. The pair left. His father just stood in shock before hastily regaining his composure and starting to follow them. Shoto! He stiffened, stopping abruptly. How dare you walk away from me? Slowly Shoto turned to face him. It happened in an instant. His father's left shoe momentarily gave off the tiniest flicker of green, and he slipped face first onto the ground with a deafening thud. Midoriya was still facing the exit. "We should probably go now." "Was that you?" Shoto whispered, quickening his pace as they made their way out of the gym. Pausing, Midoriya answered firmly, "He's a bad person." A million questions swirled in Shoto's head. How would he know? What possible reason did he have to hate the number 2 hero? Why did his father respond so strangely to the Hero Commission connection? But one question far outweighed the others. "Do you want to be friends?" "Friends?" Midoriya's voice was steeped in confusion, and he looked at Shoto, brows raised. His expression softened as his detached demeanor melted away. "Yes, I'd like that." The afternoon sun reflected brightly off of the pavement, and Kigo briefly wondered how long it had been since he'd seen Izuku so relaxed. He had just picked him up from the entrance exam and had a few hours to spare, so the two were just strolling around, aimlessly passing cafes and shops. Aside from noting he had gotten the highest score, no surprise there, Izuku hadn't really talked about the actual test much. He was preoccupied discussing the variety of quirks of the other applicants, when he abruptly went quiet. "I made a friend today," Izuku said suddenly. "What?" Kigo's eyes widened. "That's great." "Yes," Izuku massaged his hands, a nervous habit, as his voice trailed off. He couldn't have been more suspicious if he tried. Kigo waited as the pause dragged on, finally breaking the quiet. "Okay, I'm going to need more than that. What's their name?" "Shoto." "What?" His eyes widened. "Fis." "Yes." Izuku searched for a word. "Nice." Kigo ran his hand through his hair, trying to process it all. Shoto likely didn't know what actually happened to Tuya. He almost certainly had no clue about Izuku's connection to him. But something was wrong. There was no reason for Izuku to wait to tell him that. Quirk analysis was his favorite subject, but not in a million years would it come before this news. Not unless. What happened? Izuku tensed and looked down before answering. "I saw Endeavor." The name was like nails on a chalkboard. He couldn't help but think about back then. "Your dad is Endeavor?" Kigo gaped. Tuya immediately snapped, "Don't talk about him, Dash." "But his father was a hero? A real hero. Just leave me the hell alone." The red-haired boy snarled. Wisps of cobalt flame swirled around him before quickly dissipating. "Geez," Kigo took a step back. "I just thought it was cool, that's all." "Well, it isn't." His eyes were dark. "He's a shit hero and a worse dad." Kigo thought about Tuya's scars. Even in training, he always knew when he was starting to overheat. Every time he hurt himself, it was only because they weren't allowed to end the exercise without repercussions. But many of his burns were several years old. He felt sick. Tuya sighed, eyeing the singed end of his sleeve. "Just, please, don't bring him up again." Kigo just nodded. "And he never did." "I tripped him." Kigo was abruptly thrust back into the present. "You did what?" "I only controlled the edge of his shoe. There aren't any suppressants in my system right now, and his heat resistance is high. Besides, he was so angry with Shoto, he was scaring him." Izuku's face darkened. "I could tell." Kigo's heart sank. Izuku had never really spoken about his father with him, not like he had with Tuya, but he knew enough. Shit. Part of him, a quickly shrinking optimistic corner of his psyche, had hoped that Tuya's death had changed things, and maybe Shoto was doing all right. Though he honestly had known better. Endeavor didn't deserve to be called a hero. "I would do it again," Izuku lowered his voice, "but I hope Dr. Kuroda doesn't find out." Unauthorized quirk usage was definitely a punishable offense. Kigo suppressed a shudder at the extra-long training sessions and brutal experiments that always seemed to have been lying in wait whenever orders were disobeyed. Luckily, the likelihood of anyone at the commission catching wind of the incident was slim to none. "I doubt Endeavor will be spreading that story around. Just be careful, don't take unnecessary risks." Izuku didn't respond for a moment, then nodded. "Now that that's out of the way, tell me more about Shoto, and did you talk to anyone else?" Shoto knew the girl with the creation quirk, Yaoyorozu. She was very welcoming. As he continued on, Kigo couldn't help but worry about the Endeavor situation. The incident surely wasn't an isolated one. And if Izuku was to witness something like that again, well, he had a very different definition of unnecessary. You scored the highest? Congratulations. Auntie Mitsuki smiled and nudged Kaken, who grumbled in response. Why the hell should I be impressed? It's the obvious outcome. He turned to Izuku. Want to go to the park before dinner? Sure. Izuku answered quickly, if it's all right. Auntie Mitsuki shrugged. It's fine with me, just be back in an hour. Kaken was already halfway out the door. The walk to the park was short, and once they arrived Kaken immediately turned to face him. Let's train. Izuku frowned. Now? My exam is in 2 weeks. He glared downwards. I just dash. Okay, Izuku interrupted, we can spar. Kaken's head snapped up, a grin spreading across face. Though he'd never admit it, Izuku knew he was nervous about the test, or at the very least getting the highest score. Not wasting a moment, Kaken lunged, his right fist swinging. He sidestepped in response, but the other boy immediately lowered himself to the ground, his foot tracing an arc along the ground directed towards the back of Izuku's ankle. This time he jumped up, acutely appreciative of his quirk's heightened spatial awareness. The scrimmage continued for a while. Izuku's thoughts wandered as he evaded Kaken's barrage of blows. Sparring had always been a secondary component of his training, and he hadn't done any without using his quirk, consciously, that is, in years. The whole thing felt rather rebellious. Dr. Kuroda would have been furious at such a waste of time. After a while, Izuku stepped back, taking a moment to catch his breath before speaking. We should probably head back. Kaken scoffed. You're just afraid I'll win if we keep going? No, he said matter-of-factly, I'm afraid of what Auntie Mitsuki will do if we're late. TSK fine. The neighborhood was quiet, most households having already settled in for dinner. Izuku took special notice of the sky's hazy blend of orange and crimson hues. He was seldom outside at this hour, almost always training or catching up on schoolwork and sleep. Come to think of it, the day really had been awfully nice. Dr. Kuroda wouldn't be on his case about the exam anymore. He got to meet Shoto Todoroki, not that he was sure what's friends meant, spend time with Kigo, spar with Kaken, and now enjoy the sunset. I asked what you were thinking about. Izuku turned to him. I think I'm happy? Kaken blinked. Huh. His brows furrowed. What's that supposed to mean? Nothing. He shook his head before returning his gaze to the sky. Forget I said anything. You can talk to me, you know, Kaken muttered. If you ever feel... His voice trailed off. Surprised by the sudden vulnerability, Izuku was quiet for a moment before humming quietly in affirmation. They continued to walk in silence, and Izuku appreciated just how much Kaken had changed. A year and a half ago, such an interaction would have been out of the question. Still, his worries weren't the kind that needed to be shared. I wonder what UA is going to be like? If Kaken caught on to his changing the subject, he didn't call any attention to it. It's going to be fucking great obviously, he snapped, though quickly shifted to enthusiasm. Did you hear All Might is going to be on staff? All Might, huh? Izuku wondered if he'd recognize him, not that it really mattered. You could at least pretend to be excited. Kaken sighed in exasperation. He's the strongest hero you know. They were practically back at the house by this point, and Izuku could see Uncle Masaru's car pulling in the driveway. We should probably hurry in. He glanced at his phone. It's been just over an hour. Kisses. Izuku just rolled his eyes and quickened his pace. As he made his way inside the house, he thought briefly about the other teachers at UA. The information wasn't top secret, but it certainly was not publicized. Just what sort of heroes choose to stop standard, professional work and teach instead? Okay, so maybe Katsuki was a little excited about the first day of school. He and Deku had arrived at UA later than he would have liked. Somebody could not understand why it was important to get to school early on the first day, and were proceeding to make their way to their classroom. It will be interesting to be in the same class again. Deku noted absent-mindedly, looking around at the other students circulating through the halls. Yeah, I guess. Truthfully, Katsuki was absolutely thrilled. Now they would be, finally, training together, and Deku could see he was strong too, goddammit. Not that Katsuki really thought he saw him as weak, but Deku never talked about his training, and he couldn't help but feel as though the idiot thought he was protecting him or some shit. I think this is it. Deku had stopped to admire the large door labeled 1A. I bet the entryway is so big to accommodate people with mutant-type quirks. Well, you can keep looking if you want, but I'm going in. Katsuki stepped past him and opened the door. The room was relatively normal-looking, with blue linoleum floors and a large window serving as the far wall. Unsurprisingly, they were not the first ones there. Welcome. My name is Ida Tenya, and it is a pleasure to make your acquaintance. He froze, resisting the urge to immediately bring his hands up to his ears. Fucking hell, why was this asshole so loud? This was a classroom, for God's sake. The tall boy with glasses, who just shouted his introduction, was now bowing at a practically 90-degree angle. Thankfully, Deku took it upon himself to respond. Nice to meet you, my name is Midoriya Izuku and this is Bakugo Katsuki. Oh, Bakugo Katsuki. You were the one who scored highest on the entrance exam, congratulations. The initial shock had passed, so he managed a sharp, thanks, before he shoved past him. Katsuki made his way to his desk and slung his bag over the seat. Deku was still by the door and had started bombarding glasses about his quirk. Serves him right for startling him like that. Looking around, just over half of the class was settling in. He accidentally made eye contact with some guy with spiky, red hair. To Katsuki's horror, began to approach him. Hi, my name's Kirishima Aijiro. I thought you were super manly during the entrance exam. Thanks. Katsuki hesitated before introducing himself. I'm Bakugo Katsuki. Nice to meet you. He responded brightly. Honestly, the guy wasn't too annoying, which was a rare assessment, but Katsuki still didn't feel like making small talk, so he grunted in agreement and turned away. Unfortunately, shitty hair, seemingly unable to take a damn hint, kept talking. So, what middle school did you go to? Aldra Junior High. At that moment, Deku, quirk analysis apparently complete, arrived at his desk, and he could see shitty hair's eyebrows raise for a split second. It was understandable. Deku's appearance wasn't exactly typical, but if he did one thing out of line. Hello. My name's Kirishima Aijiro. The redhead smiled widely. Well, that was a pleasant surprise. The conversation continued smoothly as the rest of the class filed in. At one point, a kid with half-red half-white hair entered and Deku immediately waved. Who's that? Katsuki squinted in the boy's direction, only to be met with a confused frown. That's Todoroki. I met him at the recommendations exam. Deku said, pausing a moment before adding, we're friends. Before Katsuki could process that groundbreaking piece of information, the door opened a final time and a giant, yellow caterpillar-looking thing was revealed. Deku instantly walked to his desk and sat down, but the classroom chatter took a few moments to fizzle out as a shabbily dressed man emerged from the sleeping bag cocoon. It took 8 seconds for you to quiet down. The man's voice was tired and his appearance rather disheveled. Time is a precious resource. You lot aren't very rational, are you? The rest of the class hurried to their seats. Katsuki stared at the haggard-looking figure. He certainly didn't look like a teacher, let alone any pro-hero he could think of. Maybe Deku knew? Katsuki glanced at the boy to gauge his reaction and he looked surprised. Albeit, with Deku any emotion was subtle, but he could tell this man was eliciting some sort of response. He'd ask him about it later. I'm your homeroom teacher, Aizawa Shoyuda. Pleased to meet you. He scanned over the class, maintaining a bored expression. Change into your gym clothes and head out to the grounds. The quirk assessment test wasn't even finished, but Shoyuda could already tell this year was going to be exhausting. For starters, Uraraka and Aoyama were already experiencing physical symptoms from their quirks. Luckily, neither seemed to be overdoing it or incapacitating themselves, so it wasn't really an issue. Todoroki seemed determined to not use his fire for some reason. He was not looking forward to having to deal with that. And well, Mineta just seemed obnoxious. Also, he'd certainly had his eyes on Midoriya and Bakugo. As an underground hero, Shoyuda usually didn't have to worry about his pro-hero work and teaching work intersecting, but in the rare case it did, he could never ignore it completely. Bakugo was quite impressive, very resourceful in the ways he used his explosions. His mouth was another story, though it was no mystery where that came from. Years ago, Mitsuki mentioned in passing Bakugo and Midoriya's complicated relationship, but he saw no evidence of that, the opposite in fact, so it must have been resolved. Speaking of Midoriya, he would admit he was surprised when Mike came to him raving about the boy's performance at the recommendations exam. Though he'd maintained contact with Bakugo Mitsuki for a few years, Shoyuta hadn't seen him since those days in the hospital. Watching the footage of the exam, Midoriya was impressive to say the least. Though, right now his performance was noticeably different. Yes, he was placing in the top 3 for every event without any real flashy displays of power, but something was off. For example, in the 50-meter dash and standing long jump he propelled himself forward similarly to in the recommendations exam, but even though they were comparably easier feats, Midoriya took a split second to steady himself after, more noticeable in the standing long jump, third test, than the 50-meter dash, first test. Given what Shoyuta knew of his abilities, there was no reason for him to be displaying even minor symptoms of quirk exhaustion, so why? His eyes narrowed as he watched Midoriya fidget with some strange-looking wraps on his wrists while he waited to do the ball toss. They looked like metallic bandages. Shoyuta wasn't aware of any registered support item like that and was fairly certain the boy hadn't been wearing those during the exam. He felt a sinking sensation in his chest. Were those quirk suppressants? Instinctively, Shoyuta would have just erased the kid's quirk during his turn and told him to take this seriously, but that was an awful idea for many reasons. The suppressants couldn't have been Midoriya's idea, and also, he remembered the extreme reaction all those years ago. Midoriya. The ball, which had been levitating next to him, dropped out of the air into his hand. Yes? He turned to face Shoyuta. Well, here it goes. He honestly kind of hoped he was wrong. Are you on quirk suppressants right now? A hush fell across all the students. It was an almost absurd question after all. Yes. Midoriya responded plainly. Shoyuta blinked as the class broke into shouts of disbelief. Just how was he so casual about this? It was concerning to say the least. Take them off. Midoriya just stared at him for a moment, frowning slightly. I am supposed to keep them on. He sighed and made a mental note to ask Nezu about what the hell the Hero Commission was trying to pull here. In class you are under my authority, no one else's. You will never face any repercussions for following my instructions, but you will follow them. As if a switch had been flipped, the bandages glowed green and began to unravel. Wisps of heat curled off the ground as Midoriya's shoulders relaxed and the wraps were securely in his pockets. Well, I thought they were just a fashion thing, Kaminari mumbled in awe. The ball was once again illuminated in a green glow and rose into the air. With a deafening boom, all that remained was a trail of smoke and the faint stench of burnt rubber. Shoyuta looked at the distance measurer. It read 9,999.99 meters. The distance was estimated based on initial speed, maxing out at 10 kilometers, for gravity-bound projectiles, that is. There was a moment of quiet, but Aoyama broke the silence. Stylishly done. Wow. That's a hero-like record if I've ever seen one. Uraraka exclaimed, pumping her fist in the air. Todoroki, turning his attention from the sky back to Midoriya, merely nodded and uttered a simple, good job. Show off. Bakugo crossed his arms, but his subsequent grin betrayed the notion of any real bitterness. Thankfully, the remaining tests proceeded without any new issues. The class seemed sufficiently motivated, and Shoyuta decided not to temporarily expel anyone at the end. He'd identified enough issues as it was and didn't need the extra paperwork. Stifling the nagging feeling of guilt, Shoyuta headed back to the staff room and opened Midoriya's file. He had a lot of reading to do. How was your first day at UA? Izuku held Dr. Kuroda's cold gaze and responded with a quick, fine. He was sitting on a bed in the infirmary, shivering, getting a post-training 4 cocktail of electrolytes and who knows what else. Izuku had overloaded the collar 5 times before passing out, a new record, not that the doctor seemed to care. Good. The man raised the corners of his mouth in a sorry attempt at a smile. I trust you wore the suppressants all day? Izuku almost winced but fought back the urge, did not? He hesitated but figured an explanation probably couldn't make the situation worse. Eraserhead, or rather, Aizawa-sensei, told me I was not to wear them in his class. I see. Dr. Kuroda narrowed his eyes. And yet, I told you to wear them all day. The bandages on Izuku's neck itched. He continued, you go to UA because the Hero Commission allows it. It is a privilege that can be revoked, same as the arrangement with the Bakugas. At the mention of the Bakugas, little emerald flames sprung from Izuku's palms and traveled up his arms. He was warm for a brief instant but frantically put out the fire. Quirk usage was so not allowed in the infirmary, and the inescapable cold returned as quickly as it left. Fascinating, any trace of hostility had vanished, leaving only curiosity. That's the fastest you've regained your abilities after overloading training. Izuku said nothing, still reeling from the earlier threats. Well, I suppose I won't fault you for listening to your teacher, Dr. Kuroda said, returning to the main discussion. Eraserhead can do as he pleases in his own class. Still, you mustn't forget where your loyalties lie, right, Izuku? Right? The word felt metallic on his tongue. It was his mistake. After all, how could he forget? The Hero Commission's word was law. He shouldn't have trusted anyone who said otherwise. Good, I look forward to our session on Wednesday. He picked up his briefcase and rose to leave. You have been making excellent progress. Izuku wished the door would hit him on the way out. As the car pulled into the Bakugas driveway, Izuku tried his best not to think about the absolute train wreck of an afternoon he'd had. How could he have been so naive as to think it being the first day of school would somehow get him out of training with the collar? And on top of that, the whole mess with the suppressants. Izuku guessed he'd still wear them at school during classes, just not training. The whole incident made him feel sick, and that's on top of the chills and pounding migraine. There's something you should know, Agent Arakawa said suddenly, turning to face him. She continued, Eraserhead called me immediately after class and took full responsibility for his actions. Dr. Kuroda should have been informed. Izuku's initial shock was consumed by an overwhelming sense of relief. He had called. He managed a short, thank you for telling me. That is all. She pulled out her phone and resumed her usual activities. You may go. Making his way into the house, he made an attempt to not look half dead. It was quickly proven futile as the living room lights nearly blinded him and he stumbled back. Kachin, who had been waiting on the couch as usual, jumped up and switched off half the bulbs. Want to watch the news? Hawks is doing an interview soon. It should finish before dinner. Sure. Izuku sat down and was immediately engulfed in a throw blanket. He looked over at Kachin, who feigned innocence before defending his assault. What? You're cold, aren't you? Yes. After flipping to the correct channel, Kachin turned to him. Oh, I almost forgot. He set down the remote. Were you ever going to mention Aizawa-sensei is Eraserface? There was a long pause before Izuku finally said, Eraserhead. Aizawa-sensei is Eraserhead. Tisk, he pouted in response. You know what I meant? That's true. Izuku kept his sight fixed on the TV. I just didn't think to mention it. Kachin raised his brows in obvious suspicion. You're right. I am coming through the door like a normal person. Tashinori, donned in an old Silver Age costume, looked out at Class 1A as the students broke into an excited chatter. It was to be expected, of course. His eyes were immediately drawn to a familiar face, the boy from the bridge. He'd identified him as Midoriya Izuku earlier, of course, when he reviewed the class roster, but it was still something to see the boy in person again. Tashinori would have to take the opportunity and thank him later. Right now he had a class to teach. After giving out the costumes and leading the students down to the training grounds, he started announcing the rules for the battle exercise. We will be doing a battle exercise, heroes versus villains. Tashinori explained. The villain team must defend the weapon and the heroes must either secure the weapon or capture the villains. He proceeded to dive into the details of the exercise, and finally it was time for the matchups to begin. Tashinori definitely hadn't been boring himself with his own description of the rules or anything. The first fight was impressive to say the least. Midoriya was clearly in a league of his own in terms of both quirk usage and battle experience, but Bakugo had fought admirably as well. His explosive power was no joke. In the next one, Todoroki essentially ended it all himself, freezing the entire building in an almost absurd show of strength. As the matches progressed, a handful of other students stood out as well. Yaoyorozu with her quirks, versatility and intelligence, Kaminari with his raw potential. That electricity would be a force to be reckoned with if he could get a handle on his overcharging. The group was undoubtedly full of promising future heroes. The main reason he was at UA at all was to choose a successor. Of course, he was considering that boy Mirai had found, Mirio was it? But Toshinori felt a nagging sensation that he should be the one to select the next holder himself. Perhaps they were even in this class, though it was too soon for him to be sure. He wondered if he ever would be. Around 2 minutes into the exercise, Izuku entered the room with the weapon as Uraraka was floating on a piece of debris about midway up the side of the building. Immediately Ida charged forward with a roundhouse kick, which he dodged with ease. Faking a second kick, Ida retreated as Kaken launched his attack. Izuku, remembering how the blueprints had specified the floor was sturdy, sent shockwaves through the top layer of cement, and made sure to blow out the window and emit a flare to signal his location. Ida caught his foot in a widening crack and crashed to the ground. Kaken was relatively undeterred, so Izuku ignited the surrounding air, converging the streams of flames into a twisting shield and pushed it forward to weather his barrage of explosions, and ensure he couldn't easily feint and attack from the back. Weird as it was to be on the receiving end of such an attack once again after so many years, all Izuku felt was a strange sense of pride in the face of the powerful blasts. Kaken was this talented from instinct alone. Still, he had a task to complete. It was an enclosed space, and Izuku was fairly certain All Might would not approve of any big destructive moves to the training structure, so he was limited in his strategy. Not that that was a significant issue really. In a short gap in explosions, Izuku jumped up and used the subsequent moment of distraction to mobilize the extra debris, surrounding both of his opponents in jagged pieces. "Now Uraraka," he called out, remaining in position and keeping his attention focused on Kaken and Ida. Right on schedule, Uraraka popped in through the window and tagged the weapon. Exercise complete. He lowered himself back to the ground and dropped the scraps of cement. "Nice work," Uraraka said brightly. "Sorry, I didn't really do much." Before Izuku could assure her that her presence was quite helpful, the villains hadn't been able to commit to a 2-on-1 fight since they knew she was lurking. The sirens indicating the fight's end started blaring. The four went back to the monitor room, and Izuku rehashed his performance. Was his fire too risky given the faux weapon was a nuclear warhead? He had ensured any heated air or fire in the room stayed within a 5-foot radius of himself. Should he have tried to immobilize Ida while he was dealing with Kaken? Given the bad visibility, he could have accidentally injured him with the sharp concrete. Eventually, they reached their destination and were promptly met with loud praise from All Might. "Good job, you four," he exclaimed with vigor. "As for the VIP of the battle, I'd say it was young Midoriya." "Oh yeah, the VIP of the battle." Izuku felt part of himself relax. Even though he was at UA and there didn't seem to be any real consequences for subpar performance, he was unable to rid himself of the fear associated with not meeting expectations. The hero continued, "That was likely obvious. So does anyone have any insight they wish to share on this fight?" "I do," All Might Sensei, Yaoyorozu offered. "Ida and Bakugo had a reasonable strategy, but it hinged on being able to overwhelm Midoriya essentially one-on-one while successfully monitoring all other points of entry to ensure Uraraka didn't sneak in. However, they were unable to properly execute it, as Ida was disadvantaged in the enclosed space, and Bakugo couldn't go all out given his proximity to the weapon." She paused for a moment, choosing her next words carefully. "Midoriya capitalized on those weaknesses." "Good analysis." All Might turn to the class. "If that's all, the next pairing is the heroes, Shoji and Todoroki versus the villains, Ojiro and Hagakure." Izuku was excited to watch. "Your range and control are impressive." Shoto looked at Midoriya, surprised by the sudden interaction as the class headed into the locker rooms. "Thanks, your performance was incredible as well." He glanced to the side. "I didn't get the chance to tell you after your match." Midoriya nodded, and Shoto scanned him over. His costume was a high-tech dark jumpsuit, and it looked like it had temperature control of some kind. There was a layered metal plating on the outsides of his calves and forearms. He'd noticed it earlier but was still unsure of its function. Speaking of noticing things, Midoriya realized he was staring because of course he did. Are you confused by the metal parts? He asked as Shoto looked away again. They are detachable plates, and serve to ensure I'll always have something to use telekinesis on. They're pretty sharp though, not great for this type of training. Oh. His face was hot. Luckily, half of it was cloaked in ice. Their lockers were in the same area, and as everyone changed back into their uniforms, Shoto was careful to keep to himself. The burn marks that streaked across Midoriya's hands and arms and who knows how much else weren't any of this business. Though his chest did ache just thinking about them, he was very familiar with defensive burns, none that deep of course. His father wouldn't risk further damaging his goods. How could someone so well versed in fire's wrath use it so elegantly? If he could do it maybe God, he was being ridiculous. He didn't know him at all. Shoto certainly wasn't going to just give his father everything he wanted on an idealistic whim. But that wasn't to say he didn't want to learn more about Midoriya. Katsuki well, he wasn't exactly sure. As he buttoned up his jacket, he stopped and touched his chest where the jagged cement had been pressed against it. Not even a scratch. The look in Deku's eyes was cold, calculating. Katsuki had seen it before, but never aimed at him. Nevertheless, he blasted explosion after explosion, with an increasing sense of futility. Unable to really push himself this close to the warhead, and having to carefully monitor his footholds on the uneven ground, he finally paused to gasp for air. Instantly, Deku was above him and the room was overtaken by a harsh, emerald glow. Before his eyes could adjust to the lighting, a multitude of floor fragments converged upon him. He couldn't move an inch without bruising, scratching, or impaling himself. Now Uraraka? Deku's voice sounded impersonal, almost bored. When the exercise finished, as the pairs walked back to the monitor room, Katsuki got a better look at Deku. His breathing was regular, his costume was clean. Practically nothing indicated he'd just fought at all. Even his posture seemed straighter than normal, and his expression was so fake. Katsuki suppressed a shiver. He hadn't really known what to expect when finally seeing Deku use his quirk in an actual training session, but it was not this. Trying his best to shake those thoughts away, Katsuki finished getting dressed, while reminding himself he was being ridiculous. Deku was Deku. How dare he even almost think anything else? Shoto attempted to wrestle through the swarm of press congregating outside UA. It's Endeavor's son. A reporter shouted and shoved a microphone in his face. What does your father think about you being taught by the one-number hero? He hated being called that. Before Shoto could respond with something along the lines of, why don't you just ask my father what he thinks? Midoriya materialized next to him. Sorry. He smiled apologetically at the now frustrated journalist. We have to get to class. The two continued to push through the rest of the crowd, as Midoriya successfully outmaneuvered the other reporters. Once safely inside the gates, Shoto turned to him. Thanks. Midoriya nodded. I can't stand the press, asking questions like that. It's none of their concern. Right, he hated Endeavor too. Maybe now he had a chance to ask the reason. Why do you have a problem with Dash? Before Shoto could finish, Bakugo stormed towards them. Why'd you ditch me? He scowled. Was he calling him Deku? Midoriya just shrugged. What? He tilted his head slightly. Did you miss me, Kakin? Some sort of nickname thing? Shoto just added this to the list of confusing things about Midoriya. It was already far too long. You'll pay for this? Bakugo snarled. Okay, but later, we're all going to be late if we don't get going. The rest of the morning proceeded relatively uneventfully, and before Shoto knew it, it was lunch. He hadn't entered the cafeteria with a real seating plan, but soon found himself eating his cold soba next to Midoriya and Yaoyorozu. Uraraka and Ida were across from them, and Ida was talking about his older brother, Ingenium, as the conversation had somehow shifted to personal histories. Wow. That's so cool. Uraraka exclaimed brightly. What about you, Midoriya? What's your family like? Kirishima and Bakugo had been having some separate conversation on the other end of the table, but at that question, Bakugo immediately butted in. What's it to you? Uraraka raised her eyebrows in surprise. Sorry? She shrunk back in her seat. I didn't mean anything by it. Well, you should mind your damn business. It's fine, Midoriya interrupted. It's a perfectly natural question after all. My parents passed away a long time ago, so I actually live with Kaken. A stunned silence overtook the table, as everyone looked back and forth from Midoriya to Bakugo. It was quite the heavy declaration, but Midoriya must be used to mentioning it in passing, as he didn't appear to be that bothered at all. Though, it seemed almost like a rehearsed response. But Shoto supposed if he was an orphan he'd properly have a default sentence-long explanation as well. Who was he to judge anyway? He pushed the thought out of his mind. Still, something didn't add up. What about Midoriya's connection to the Hero Commission? Bakugo seemed to be unaffiliated with the organization, as he took the general entrance exam, and, though certainly powerful, he lacked Midoriya's level of battle experience and tact. Shoto's thoughts were interrupted by the high-pitched wail of an alarm piercing the cafeteria. The intercom started blasting a warning. All students, please evacuate in an orderly fashion. Security level 3 has been broken. Bakugo visibly winced, and Midoriya made a series of hand gestures, which he later realized were, in fact, sign language, before turning back to the group. We should go now. Unfortunately, that was easier said than done. They attempted to evacuate in a calm fashion, but the room had descended into chaos. People were flocking towards the exits, and even once they made it into the hallway there was no sign of order. Hands, legs, bodies were pressed together every which way, and Shoto tried his best to keep everyone in view. Kirishima was trying in vain to direct people, but his voice was just lost in the panic. Midoriya was a few feet to his left, jammed next to Bakugo. Suddenly, Ida popped up right in front of him. There's no danger, it's just the media, he announced, looking around in frustration at the continued pandemonium. We have to let people know. Midoriya responded promptly, I can lift you by your coat into the air. He began to unwrap his suppressants. Here's a megaphone you can use. Yaoyorozu chimed in from behind him, handing the device to Ida. Midoriya successfully raised him up, and Ida activated his quirk, launching himself onto the exit sign. He gripped the megaphone and addressed the masses. Everything's fine. It's just the press. There's no reason to panic. Behave in a way befitting for UA students. Luckily, people were receptive, and the crisis was averted. Later that day, they held elections for class officers. For his efforts, Ida was elected president, with Yaoyorozu as the vice president. Shoto was happy with the results, having voted for Yaoyorozu. He just had a feeling Midoriya held no interest in the role. Hello students. Welcome to the Unforeseen Simulation Joint, or USJ. The Pro Hero 13 announced enthusiastically. Izuku was impressed by the facility. The expansive glass dome that made up the roof ushered in rays of sunlight, which illuminated the different practice zones. It was definitely on the larger side of any he'd been in, and the variety of terrains didn't leave much to be desired in terms of flexibility of training. 13 continued, my quirk is called Black Hole. It allows me to absorb and disintegrate anything, not even light can escape. I use it to save people in all kinds of disasters, but my power could easily kill. So that's the sort of discussion this was. A few members of the class shifted uncomfortably. I've no doubt there are some among you with similar abilities. We must never forget that it only takes one wrong move with an uncontrollable quirk for people to die. As if Izuku could ever forget. The backup quirk suppressants in his utility belt felt heavy, and he became acutely aware of Eraserhead standing off to the side. The hero was among the few that knew just what he'd done when his quirk manifested. Not even Kaken had ever gotten a real explanation. In an instant, Izuku was ripped from this train of thought as he felt a shift in the matter of his surroundings. A moment later, a portal opened up in the center of the facility and dozens of figures started pouring out. Is this a test? Kirishima asked, his eyes darting around nervously. No, don't move. Putting on his goggles and stepping forward, Eraserhead's voice was low and sharp. Those are villains. Was he planning on fighting all of them himself? His quirk was not suited to dealing with that many enemies, but he was a pro hero, and not one to be underestimated. None of you are to engage any villains unless absolutely necessary. He continued, Kaminari, Use your quirk to try and signal UA we are under attack. Yes, sensei? He yelped in response. Alright, everyone remain calm. As heroes in training you must be able to quickly adapt to unprecedented circumstances. He turned to face his co-instructor. 13, protect the students. 13 nodded and Eraserhead lunged towards the epicenter of the attack. Within moments a battle induced, and Izuku watched closely for any indication it wasn't under the hero's control. Most of the villains had weak auras, but 3 of them looked much brighter, though it was hard to really tell at this distance. A slight panic was breaking out amongst the class, though most were frozen in a stunned silence. Ida started saying something about evacuating, but Izuku had no intention of doing that. Suddenly, he sensed another presence growing near the class. 13, Izuku called out a moment before another dark cloud of mist materialized, this time coalescing into a ghostly humanoid shape. It was one of the strong ones. Greetings, UA students. The mist spoke. We, the League of Villains, are here to end the life of All Might, the symbol of peace. League of Villains? Izuku had never heard of them before, but that didn't really mean much with respect to their strength. He wasn't exactly privy to any top-secret information that didn't directly concern him. 13 waved the class towards the door. Get back, all of you. Unfortunately, Izuku didn't have much confidence in their ability. 13 was primarily a rescue-type hero, and likely not acclimated to combat. And furthermore, there were 20 students in the class. That was a lot of people to protect. He wanted to assist, but disobeying a direct order would likely just create more chaos and confusion. So, he just watched as 13 activated their quirk, attempting to create a suction zone to function as a kind of defensive wall. The villain merely warped out of range and continued. Now, contrary to our intel, he does not seem to be here. Still, all of you grouped together could prove troublesome. I shall remedy this. Begone. The world turned dark as the class was engulfed in black mist. Damn it. He should have just attacked. If anyone gets hurt, it's his fault. But it was too late now, and moments later Izuku found himself falling towards the surface of a lake. The subsequent battle was quick. Azui and Mineta were the only other students in the flood zone, and the 10 or so villains were incredibly weak, so the 3 reached the shore with relative ease. What'll we do now? Mineta whined, crouching behind Azui. Izuku just frowned at the other boy's cowardice. We need to see if Aizawa-sensei needs. He caught sight of the center of the plaza and his stomach dropped. Eraserhead was locked in combat with a strong villain, but there was some grotesque aura almost totally obscuring both. Usually, the lights Izuku could see were akin to fingerprints, but this one was fractured with several distinct bright patches. What was that? Midoriya, Azui said quietly. An awful, animalistic screech ripped through the air. In a split second, the thing charged at Eraserhead and slammed him to the ground. Stay here. Izuku yelled to Azui and Mineta as activated his quirk and flung himself towards the hero. Once in range, he grabbed hold of the monstrosity and pushed. With an aura like that, it couldn't really be human, could it? His lungs burned and a bead of sweat dripped down his forehead. It didn't budge but at least seemed to be frozen in place. Where the hell did you come from? A crusty-looking figure covered in multiple sets of hands approached Izuku. Right, the villain Eraserhead had been fighting. Was he in charge of the operation? The villain continued, apparently unfazed by his lack of response. You seem to be enjoying playing with the Nomu. Tell me your name. Midoriya Izuku. His muscles shook as the Nomu's skin started steaming. Was it a person? Could he just burn it? What if it was a person? Thankfully, Eraserhead was still breathing, and his eyes flickered open as he partially regained consciousness. There was no time to hesitate. Midoriya Izuku. He raked his fingers along the side of his neck. Well, I don't know how you're still holding the Nomu, but it's got a job to do. Green flames shot up the Nomu's arms and legs, converging in its center and then emanating outwards again. Hotter and hotter and hotter. Its heat tolerance was so high and combined with its power density it was nearly impossible to telekinetically control. But, fine, if Izuku couldn't move it, he'd incapacitate it. The Nomu howled in pain, but he ignored the twinges of guilt. It was the only option. It was the only option. Wow, you had another move, huh? You're a higher level than I thought. The villain walked to him. I'll let you live, but I can't have you messing with the plans any longer. The world grew blurry and blood began leaking from his nose. He was just steps away now. My name is Shigaraki Tamura, by the way. Izuku felt the weight of Shigaraki's hand on his shoulder. Nothing happened. Oh, why aren't you disintegrating? He looked at Eraserhead, who had propped himself up on his unbroken elbow and was glaring in the villain's direction. Wow, you're so cool, Eraserhead. Small cracks radiated from his position to the Nomu, and Izuku felt as if someone had taken a jackhammer to his skull. He estimated he had another 30 seconds before passing out. Shigaraki smirked. You can't keep your eyes open forever though. I wonder how long until you fail this precious student of yours. The hand on his shoulder tightened, but Izuku stayed frozen in place, resisting the urge to step away. He couldn't afford any lapse in concentration. The mist villain materialized behind Shigaraki and began to speak. 13 is incapacitated, but there were some students I failed to warp away, and a fast one escaped. Though he was injured, Shigaraki released Izuku and shifted his focus. Ha! Kurojaryu, I'd turn you to dust if you weren't our ticket out of here. We won't stand a chance against dozens of pros, it's game over. He turned back to Izuku. Still, I'd like to have a little fun before I go. The entrance swung open and a thundering voice rang through the entire building. Fear not. I am here. In the blink of an eye, All Might was in between him and Shigaraki with Eraserhead in his arms. Relief coursed through his body and he relented. His knees buckled, but All Might caught him before he hit the ground, and moments later he was gently being set down, next to Azui, Mineta, and a once again unconscious Eraserhead. You all fought bravely. I am sorry I did not arrive sooner. The hero turned to Azui and Mineta. Do either of you have any injuries? Azui shook her head. We can help Aizawa-sensei and Mito. Fine. Izuku cut in, wiping the blood off his chin. His chest was heavy. He stared right at All Might. Something was wrong. The hero's aura was flickering? It was similar to that day in the tunnel, but instead of an odd blink it was a high-frequency flashing, like a sort of strobe light. He'd ignored it then, dismissing it as just a trick of the light, but now, it was unmistakable. What did it mean? All Might frowned. No, you have done enough. Well, Izuku looked at Azui and Mineta. You can't carry both of us, right? I just need a few seconds, and I'll be right behind you. I do not think. All Might was interrupted by the Nomu, ashy and smoking from Izuku's flames, charging towards the group. He leapt into action, planting a heavy punch square on the Nomu's chest. Eraserhead's eyes fluttered. Take him to safety. Izuku looked at Azui. Please? We'll go. We have no problem leaving. Mineta jumped up and prepared to lift Eraserhead. Azui just frowned. You'll be right behind us? Izuku nodded and prepared to stand up, ignoring the growing dizziness. They began to make their way out of the plaza, but, surprisingly, Izuku made no attempt to follow. All Might was struggling now. Kurojaryu had joined the battle and was helping the Nomu attack whilst in the hero's hold. His aura was dimming rapidly. Staggering to his feet, Izuku managed one step before crashing to his knees. Bile rose up in the back of his throat, and his vision filled with dark spots. No, he had to stay awake. Dai! Kaken burst onto the scene, driving an explosion right onto Kurojaryu's metal neck brace. Todoroki followed suit, icing over the Nomu. Kirishima was close behind and looked to be sizing up Shigaraki. Before Izuku could signal Kirishima to stay far away from the hand freak, the Nomu broke free of the ice and swung at Kaken. A cloud of dust swallowed the area, and Izuku could not breathe. When it cleared, he saw All Might had swept him out of the way and blocked the hit. Midoriya! Todoroki shouted, eyes wide. Kaken and Kirishima, who thankfully had not attacked, whipped their heads in his direction, and the three deferred the fight to All Might and quickly made their way to his side. Meanwhile, All Might raged against the Nomu, each hit shaking the building, like two titans were locked in combat. Deku! What happened? Kaken's voice was higher than normal, his eyebrows knit in concern. I saw on my way over. You were holding the monster thing back, weren't you? Todoroki interrupted. Are your injuries quirk exhaustion? Izuku nodded. You held it back? Kirishima questioned incredulously. That's so manly. Kaken looked downright pissed. Why? The group went silent as All Mights rained a flurry of punches down upon the Nomu. Pluyuis yole, he bellowed, landing a final punch that sent it flying up through the ceiling and into the sky. Turning to Shigaraki, All Might smiled. Well, villain, how about we finish this? Shigaraki scratched his neck again and whined. What? You cheated. You're not any weaker than before, it was all a lie. Well, coming to get me? All Might glared at Shigaraki. If you can take it, bring it on. Oh my god, he was bluffing. Izuku watched horrified as the hero's aura dimmed almost completely, the bright flashes few and far between. We need to get out of here. Kaken turned towards him, but frowned upon seeing his expression. What is it? Something's wrong. Before he could elaborate, Shigaraki and Kurojairi charged. Izuku, using the last drops of adrenaline from when Kaken was in danger, hurled himself in front of All Might. Midoriya. The hero sounded alarmed, but his voice was strained. Izuku kicked up the dust around them and whipped it into spinning streams, briefly shielding the two from the villains. What is this now? Why are you in my way again? Shigaraki warped in front of him. Sorry, maybe I will kill you after all. He outstretched his hand, but Izuku had enough in pushed. A fierce emerald glow illuminated Shigaraki's body as he was lifted off the ground. The villain was strong, yes, but so much lighter than the Nomu. Too light. Suddenly everything was sweltering hot. Shigaraki shrieked in agony as his skin began to steam. He had to stop, but letting go meant All Might was in danger. His aura was almost gone. What did that mean? Streams of green flame joined the dust and it all spun faster and faster. Shigaraki screamed for Kurojairi. He was screaming it was his fault, his fault, his fault. Shigaraki vanished in a cloud of black mist. But the damage was done. Izuku felt his grasp on reality slipping away as his feet left the floor and the tempest of debris picked up speed. The last thing he remembered was seeing Kaken and Todoroki running towards him. Fuck. This is bad. Bakuga's eyes were wide. I need to get to Deku right now. Kirishima started. We can all. Oh. If you don't have a high heat tolerance you'll get burnt trying to give him the injection. I'll help, but... Shoto looked on in horror. What's wrong with Midoriya? And injection? There's no time to explain, just listen to me. Bakuga turned to Kirishima. You check on All Might, we'll deal with Deku, okay? Kirishima nodded and the two were off. As they approached Midoriya, the temperature increased exponentially. It was a dry heat and with the swirling dust and chunks of ground, the area almost felt like a sandstorm. Midoriya looked terrified. His eyes were wild and glossy as he ripped off his utility belt and tossed it. He then held up 2 fingers before pressing his hands on the sides of head as tears streamed down his face. Seeing Midoriya like his, it was as if someone had driven a knife through his chest, but there was simply no time to panic. Amidst the chaos, Bakuga managed to pick up the belt and pulled out 2 syringes, handing one to him. We need to inject him with these, and don't touch his skin, it's really hot. Got it? Shoto just nodded. Good. His voice shook slightly. Follow me. With Bakuga leading the charge, Shoto was close behind, putting up wall after wall of ice, shielding the pair from debris and wayward streams of fire. Once they reached Midoriya and Bakuga jumped up and wasted no time sticking the syringe in his arm. The air cooled instantly, though the turmoil showed no signs of stopping. Deku, can you hear me? He looked up, shouting through the howling winds and rubble. Get back, Midoriya rasped. I can't. The surrounding flames flew to him, merging into a burning, viridescent shroud. The heat alone caused Bakuga to stagger backwards, but Shoto rushed in and quickly administered the injection. Midoriya dropped like a rock and he caught him as the chaos ground to a halt. Shoto held him, ignoring the burns forming on his arms and chest, and tried to cool the boy off with ice, but his temperature was so high it evaporated instantaneously. Breathing heavily, Midoriya looked up at Shoto through the steam, though his gaze seemed far away. Tuya? Toshinori was disgusted with himself. Sitting in a hospital bed in his emaciated form, he played the day's events back in his mind for the 100th time. His strength was waning. Facing the villains, Toshinori wondered morbidly how long he could keep up the facade. Just a minute more, the other staff would surely arrive soon. He had enough power to hold his form, but any more attacks would put him over the edge. To his dismay, they charged, and Toshinori braced himself for a final stand. At the very least, he could neutralize the enemy. If his true condition was revealed, well, he'd just have to worry about that later. Suddenly, in a flash of green, Midoriya landed in front of him. The boy then protected them both by swirling the surrounding dust and debris fast enough to halt the villain's assault. Impossible. How did he know? But something was wrong. The area was filled with a piercing white emerald light, and Toshinori heard screaming. Midoriya? Oh, one of the villains. Just who was this boy? Before he could try and get closer, the wails stopped. The mist villain must have warped them out. Though, the tempest continued, and the temperature of the area grew hotter and hotter. Toshinori realized quickly, Midoriya had lost control. Who could blame him in such a frightening situation? Damn it. A student needed his help, and he had no idea how to give it. All Might, are you all right? A voice yelled through the noise. He recognized it as belonging to Kirishima. That was no good. The area wasn't safe. Don't get closer. Toshinori shouted, it's dangerous. Bakugo knows how to calm down Midoriya. Kirishima called back, he and Todoroki are working on it now. What could they possibly do? The air cooled abruptly and enough rubble fell to slightly increase visibility. In the moments that followed, Toshinori could just make out Todoroki jumping up into a mass of green flames before everything stopped. Once the dust cleared, he saw Bakugo running towards a barely conscious Midoriya, lying in Todoroki's arms. The doors to USJ swung open, and the UA faculty entered, quickly making their way to the plaza and rushing to the aid of the other students scattered throughout the various terrains. Standing pitifully still as Cementos erected walls around him, he could finally relax to his emaciated form. Toshinori prayed no other students were injured and cursed his sick sense of ego and pride that let him get to this point. It was time to pick a successor. There was a knock on the door. Can I come in? It was Naomasa. Great, even though the man was well aware of his secret, Toshinori still was embarrassed to be seen in such a state. Yes. He managed weakly. Aizawa and 13 are both in stable condition. Naomasa sat down in the lone chair next to the bed, and none of the students had severe injuries. Toshinori furrowed his brow. What about Midoriya Izuku? He surely required some medical attention. Midoriya? He tapped his briefcase. That's right, I meant to get his statement, but he wasn't admitted. I'd assumed he went home and planned on getting it later, but if you're certain... The man pulled out an evidence folder and started rifling through it. Removing a sheet of paper, he pulled out his phone and made a call. Hello, this is Detective Tsukachi. I am calling to check up on Midoriya Izuku. Is this his guardian? There was a short period of quiet as whoever was on the line responded, and Naomasa frowned. I see, he said sharply. Thank you for your time. Is something wrong? Toshinori asked after Naomasa hung up. Yes, he looked straight at him. Since when did the Hero Commission start sending their trainees to UA? What? Hero Commission? Admittedly, Toshinori knew less about their work than he should. He was not really a fan of that organization. They were far too in the shadows for his taste. Toshinori, sometimes I don't know how you've been number one for so long. Naomasa sighed, though I suppose you'd have no reason to interact with them. Putting the paper back in the folder, he continued, around 10 years ago, they started an initiative called the Hero Development Program. Essentially, it takes children with powerful, often destructive, quirks and trains them to be heroes from a young age. I really don't know too much about it though, just that the selection process seems fairly opportunistic and the whole thing is highly classified. So, young Midoriya is, where? Toshinori cut in with growing unease. Naomasa responded. Midoriya was taken directly to a commission facility, but apparently he sustained no serious injuries. That's good. He paused, not aware of his circumstances. He really saved me, you know. I would like to thank him for his efforts the next time I see him. That, and perhaps ask him a few questions. Naomasa raised his eyebrows. He saved you? Yes, Toshinori answered. I don't know if he knew I needed help, but right as I neared my limit Midoriya rushed to my defense. You should be careful with him. His voice was low. The commission can't learn the truth about your situation. I know that, Toshinori looked away, but, still, this isn't the first time I've been impressed by his actions. I want to get to know him more. Sighing again and shaking his head, Naomasa waited a while before offering a few words of warning. Just don't be reckless, Toshinori. He hesitated. I can look into the boy's history with the commission if you wish. That organization is really no place for children. Thank you, I would greatly appreciate it, Toshinori said quickly. Because, at least based on what he'd seen from Midoriya, he couldn't agree more. Bakugu! Shitty Hair called out to him and waved. Katsuki was really in no mood to talk, but whatever, if he had to talk to someone. He didn't turn away as the boy walked over. So, the redhead continued, his eyes darting around the classroom, No, Katsuki interrupted sharply, Deku's not here. He's fine, just busy with hero commission stuff. He hated this. He hadn't seen Deku since those assholes just carted him away at USJ, and now everyone was going to be asking him questions like he had a damn clue what was going on. Shitty Hair's eyes widened. Oh, I'm glad he's all right. He fidgeted with the bottom seam of his shirt. I can't believe we only got a day off. Yeah. Katsuki resisted the urge to pull out his phone for the 1,000th time and check for any texts from Deku. The conversation continued, but he mostly just nodded at various things Shitty Hair said. The other boy was probably just trying to take his mind off of things anyway. Of course, just before class started and Katsuki actually thought he had a chance to not have to talk with anyone, Icy Hot approached his desk. Fucking perfect. Where is Midoriya? Is he in the hospital? His voice had an edge to it. The nerve. Like he knew anything about Deku at all. He's not here, Katsuki bit back, and it's none of your goddamn business. Shitty Hair mumbled uncomfortably before turning to Icy Hot. Midoriya's okay, he's doing hero commission things. What? He frowned, but? I said, it's none of your fucking business. Katsuki snapped. He was seriously going to blast this asshole if he kept bothering him with these stupid questions. Icy Hot's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, Ponytail showed up and dragged him away, as the door opened and Aizawa-sensei limped in. Jesus, the man was covered head to toe in bandages. What the hell? Was he doing in school like that when Deku was still God knows where? I want to thank you all for your bravery at USJ. No one sustained any critical injuries. His voice was tired. For those of you concerned, Midoriya is doing fine and will be in class soon. How did he know? That is all. Aizawa-sensei turned to the board. Now, let's begin. The rest of the period was technically uneventful. Katsuki alternated between taking notes, exchanging glares with Icy Hot, the fucking nerve of that loser. Just because he helped once doesn't mean he had any right to information that didn't concern him, and pretending he didn't notice Shitty Hair's worried glances. Mostly, Katsuki just hoped that Deku would somehow just be home when he got back. Even if not, the nerd wasn't going to be gone for years, just for a few days at most. It was not like last time. It's a strange feeling, knowing you've hit your limit. For Izuku, it was never really a physical sensation. When it came to that type of exertion, he could push and push and push, until he went unconscious, then wake up and keep going. No, this was not that. Izuku felt at UJ there was worry, fear, even anger. But now, sitting in his freezing room, there was nothing at all. What had happened since? Everything after the villains warped out was a blur. Incredible, Dr. Kuroda exclaimed. He was injected twice, and it's already worn off? Someone nodded. Izuku wasn't sure who. Being strapped to a stretcher didn't exactly provide a good vantage point. Was everyone all right? Did he hurt anyone? Perfect, we've been waiting for an opportunity like this. Prep him for testing. The man looked down at him. You've got quite the job cut out for you today. He wanted to ask what it was, but questions only ever made things worse. His head pounded, and there was a burning sensation in the back of his throat like he'd been throwing up. How many days had he been here? Sitting in the chair, Izuku listened to the doctor's cold voice blare through the speaker. Instead of just overloading the collar, you're going to break it? White-hot panic shot through his body, and he couldn't break it? Izuku's chest rose and fell rapidly as he began to hyperventilate, though the restraints prevented any deep breaths. All right now? He choked back tears. I don't think. Spare me your thoughts. You know it's dangerous when you're out of control like this. You should be thankful we are monitoring this as an experiment and not just putting it on and shutting you in a freezer. The man waited for a moment, letting Izuku stew in his own shame before continuing. Unless you would prefer that? No. His voice was hollow. I'm sorry. All right, the doctor said smugly as he felt the collar's needles pierce the perpetually irritated skin on his neck. Let's begin. That was his last coherent memory. After that was just terrible cold and pain and cracking metal, again and again and again, and Izuku touched his neck and winced. It was covered in thick bandages, as were his ankles and wrists, he noted, proceeding with an almost robotic assessment of his condition. Looking from the 4 in his arm up to the machine measuring his vitals, Izuku read the screen. 117 degrees Fahrenheit. Ah, so that's why he didn't feel cold. There was no telling how long it'd take to drop to 105 degrees, which was then no longer at an increased risk of incinerating everything in his path temperature. So, Izuku grabbed his phone. Luckily he had 2, of course the second one was solely for commission business. Still, it had Kigo's number. Izuku, hello. He responded immediately. Kigo, are you alright? Izuku, yes. Izuku, is everyone else? Kigo, everyone is fine. Class resumed as normal on Thursday. With that, he settled fully into a comforting apathy. But also Thursday? Izuku checked the date. It was Saturday, and 3:57 am. Though, he technically was still confused as to what exactly was going on with All Might, but that could wait. Kigo wouldn't know anything about it anyway. Kigo, how are you actually doing? What did he mean by that? Izuku, I am fine. Kigo was typing for a moment, but he deleted the message. Kigo, we'll talk later. I'm sorry I have to go, I'm on a mission. So that's why he was up at this hour. Izuku sent a quick spite before clicking the phone off. There was a dampened whirring sound as more cold air was blasted into the room. When he had a fever this high, the temperature control readjusted every hour. Izuku just had to do better. Kigo shouldn't have to worry about him like this, not when it all was his fault. And how could he feel so empty? Villains don't care who they hurt. Villains lose control. Izuku couldn't be a villain, he could never be anything like him, so there was only one way forward. The only way there'd ever been, really. It was so simple, just do as he's told. No hesitation, no frustration, no wishing for it all to stop one day, holding out for someone to take him far away from this facility or the courage to do it himself. After all, it worked for Kigo, didn't it? Totally committing to this life. Izuku thought he had a long time ago, but then there was Tuya's death and he was so angry and didn't trust anyone. None of that mattered now. He needed to grow up and make the right decision. Izuku didn't want to be dangerous anymore. So he surrendered. Katsuki wished the raindrops would shut the fuck up already. He was sitting in his room, trying and failing to ignore the storm outside, when the doorbell rang. His mother must have been downstairs already, because once she was in the process of opening the front door by the time he rushed down. It swung open, and the annoying agent lady stepped in. Deku followed closely behind, wearing a hooded black rain jacket. Izuku, how are you doing? His mother asked softly. Fine, thanks. He proceeded to peel off the coat and hang it on the rack adjacent to the door. Katsuki froze as his mother inhaled sharply. What the hell happened? Deku was wearing a loose t-shirt, at least he wasn't cold, which left the bandages on his arms and neck in full view. Those injuries were not from USJ. He'd seen the bruising on his wrists and those terrible puncture marks before, but just how bad were they now that they needed to be covered? That wasn't all, he looked like he hadn't slept in days, and his hair was completely white. Sorry for not contacting you, he continued, massaging his hands. My phone was dead. It's all right, his mother quickly assured him, plastering a warm smile on her face. You're here now. She turned to the agent, and if looks could kill. Izuku should have no problems returning to school tomorrow, the dark-haired woman said flatly, and his arrangement with the commission has been updated. His training has been increased to include Tuesdays and Thursdays, so every day after school, in addition to the usual Friday through Sunday morning. You can't be serious? His mother was fuming. That's far too much. I won't allow it. It is not yours to allow, the agent spoke sharply, and Izuku already agreed to these alterations. He did what? There's no reason to worry, Auntie. Deku's face was infuriatingly blank. Was this fucking brainwashing? What kind of crap was he pulling right now? Oh God, what did they do to him? Can Deku and I go upstairs now? He looked at his mother. She nodded. Yes, that's a good idea. I have a few more things to say to Agent Arakawa. Well, Katsuki was happy to get the hell out of that mess, but a few minutes later he found himself sitting on the floor of Deku's room watching the other boy flip through pages of homework. I'm sure the teachers will understand if you need an extension. It's 3 days of work after all. I just don't want to fall behind, Deku said slowly. Any traces of the energy he'd had upon arrival were quickly seeping away, as he picked up a pencil and attempted to start on a math worksheet. His grip was awkward, and after a few clumsy strokes, the writing utensil clattered to the ground as Deku grabbed his hand. Sorry. He mumbled, I'm not supposed to use my quirk until tomorrow morning. I'll write for you, Katsuki declared, snatching the pencil before Deku could reach it. That's really not necessary? I don't care. He huffed before glancing to the side. Just let me do this, okay? All right. Taking the materials with him, he sat next to Katsuki and proceeded to hand them over. The two worked quietly for a while, getting through most of the material before Deku dozed off. At 5 p.m. Obviously, Katsuki finished the rest of it, but after organizing the papers, he just felt ashamed. Was this really all he could do? Deku was hurting, and he was useless just like before. Kurogiri, my skin still hurts. You've already had the proper treatment, Kurogiri sighed. There's nothing else I can do. Tamura grunted and disintegrated the salt shaker in front of him. That was unnecessary. Before he could reply, the door creaked open and a figure entered the bar. Whoa, looking a little toasty there, Shigs. You trying to copy me or something? Shut up, Dabi, Tamura hissed, and don't call me that. He just rolled his eyes. I'm only here to meet Jiren. What happened to you anyways? One of the stupid UA brats tried to cook me, Tamura complained. Kurogiri's starting to look into him, but I swear the kid lives off the grid. Him. Dabi raised an eyebrow. Got a name? Yeah, Midoriya Izuku. Huh? Interesting. His phone dinged, and upon reading the message, he stood up. What? Tamura spun around on his bar stool to face him. Do you know him? Jiren switched up the meeting spot. Dabi ignored the question and waved, making his way to the exit. I'll see you later. Dabi. The door clattered shut. My apologies for his disrespect, Shigaraki Tamura, Kurogiri said, polishing a glass. He seriously gets on my nerves. He poked the ashes on the counter. I'm glad Sensei hardly ever makes me see him. Yes, Kurogiri agreed and continued, and I will find out more about this Midoriya Izuku. What is your interest in him? Do you seek revenge? What do you care? Tamura went to scratch his neck, before groaning as he remembered the first-degree burns covering it, and, I don't know. Something about the brat was bothering him. He'd figure it out later. Shoto was already seated when Midoriya entered the classroom, trailing behind Bakugo. The momentary happiness from the boy's return was instantly replaced with a growing concern that something was very wrong. First off, for someone who just had a week off of school, Midoriya did not look well rested at all. His expression was blank as usual, but while before it seemed more like a mask, which slipped on occasion, this was as if his mind was just somewhere else entirely. Also, his hair was entirely white. For some reason, he wanted to talk to him, ask him the questions playing on loop in his mind. How did he know of Tuya? Why would he say his name in such a delirious state? Were the two of them close? But Midoriya went straight to his desk and Bakugo didn't leave his side. Even Shoto could recognize it as a bad time. Though, so was the next time and the time after that. Midoriya seemed so far out of reach. In break periods, instead of eagerly interrogating their classmates about quirks, he dozed off at his desk. Even during hero training, His demeanor was drastically different. Each action was swift, sharp, and calculated. Midoriya never left opponents with more than the odd sprain, but the style was almost incomparable to the delicate, graceful usage of his quirk Shoto'd seen before. He was concerned to say the least. "Hello. Can you hear me?" Shoto snapped back to the present as Momo waved a hand in front of his face. Sorry." He paused, resisting the urge to stare at Midoriya, who'd just been nudged awake by Bakugo. "You're still worried, aren't you?" Momo asked quietly, stealing a quick glance in the boy's direction. "He's just acting differently. And he apparently has some mystery connection to a certain dead relative." "Well, we all are to an extent." She sighed. "USJ was tough on everyone, and we didn't really know Midoriya before. I'm sure he just needs time to process it." "No, that couldn't be it. Surely someone with his level of training wouldn't be so thrown by an event that they'd entirely change their demeanor and combat style." Suddenly, Shoto felt an overwhelming sense of guilt. Midoriya was clearly going through something. How could he be so selfish as to be distracted by his curiosity about Tuya? Shoto couldn't even be sure he hadn't misheard that. Momo continued, unfazed by his lack of response. "It's fine to be concerned for his well-being. I am as well, of course. But don't let yourself get too worked up." "Not get too worked up?" Shoto just nodded. Fine, if Momo didn't believe him, so be it. He'd just find out what was going on himself. Young Midoriya. Stopping abruptly, Izuku turned around to see All Might waving at him from down the hall. "Come, join me for lunch." Kaken looked back and forth between him and the hero. "What's that about?" He just shrugged. "Go to lunch, I'll see you later." "All right." Kaken hesitated but joined Kirishima, who was already a few paces ahead. Walking with All Might, Izuku felt a slight sense of dread. Had he done something wrong? Perhaps it was about his actions at USJ? Before he knew it, he found himself sitting on a stool across from the teacher, 2 cups of tea between them. "You know, don't you?" All Might's voice was low. Izuku's heart sank. He remained expressionless, but his mind raced. This was it. Whatever was happening with his quirk obviously was top-secret info. He had to be in trouble. Was All Might going to report him for sticking his nose where it didn't belong? Had he already? Agent Arakawa hadn't said anything. "Be honest with me," he paused, "please." After his actions at USJ, Izuku couldn't exactly feign ignorance. He'd just have to accept any consequences. "Your quirk is unstable." Izuku stared up at the hero but was distracted by the now familiar flashing disrupting his aura. A strange look overtook All Might's face, a sort of somber relief. "That's one way to put it." He folded his hands in his lap. "Might I ask how you realized?" He shifted in his seat. "Part of my quirk lets me see auras, which glow in proportion to a person's power, especially for emitter-type quirks." Izuku hesitated. "Yours flickers." "Ah," All Might sighed. "I suppose there's no real harm in this then." The room filled with steam as the hero's inner light blinked off. When it cleared, an emaciated figure sat before him. Gasping quietly, Izuku's eyes widened. All Might. Though his appearance was almost entirely different, it was unmistakably still the #1 hero. "Yes, this is mine truth form now." He hesitated. "I will explain, but first, have you told anyone?" It could be a trick question, but lying probably wouldn't help him now. Dr. Kuroda always seemed to find things out anyhow. "No." All Might immediately relaxed. "What a relief. You seem to be the cautious type, so I suspected you hadn't." A slight flush formed across his cheeks. "I really should have pulled you aside sooner. I apologize for waiting this long. It must have been stressful for you." He proceeded to bow his head. What was happening? Instead of an interrogation regarding the exact nature of his quirk, or at the very least a call to his superiors to verify he hadn't responded irresponsibly to the possession of such sensitive information, All Might went on to describe a horrific injury and subsequent reduction in quirk capacity. The hero stared downwards in unwarranted embarrassment, only raising his head to meet Izuku's gaze once he finished the tale of misfortune. "I'm afraid I'll have to ask one more thing of you." He picked a now room temperature cup of tea off the table. "My situation is highly classified. The UA staff are aware, a necessity of course given my time limit, and 2 other individuals which have proven trustworthy over the years. Impossible? Dr. Kuroda didn't know? So what I'm saying is, you absolutely cannot tell anyone. I understand this puts you in an uncomfortable position, especially given your standing with the Hero Commission. It isn't your fault you're privy to this secret, so I'm just pleading for your discretion. The hero bowed his head again, as the gravity of the situation fell squarely on Izuku's shoulders. To not tell the commission. It was almost unthinkable. Still, technically he was under no obligation to report on anything occurring at UA. It would have been a strange order, as the doctor didn't really seem to care about the school other than the publicity it provided, and its potential to interfere with his usual training schedule. I won't. He looked the hero straight in the eye. I promise. Again, the doctor probably wouldn't think to ask anyway, and if he did, the man's voice thundered coldly through his head, you mustn't forget where your loyalties lie, right, Izuku? He wouldn't dare. Good, thank you so much for your understanding. All Might relaxed back into the sofa. I certainly don't deserve it, given my handling of all this. Izuku nodded, and a sinking feeling took hold in the pit of his stomach, which he proceeded to ignore. He couldn't do anything about it anyway. Oh, he had messed up. Big time. Shoyuta could hardly remember the last time he'd failed to spectacularly at handling a situation as delicate as this one, but that Monday when Midoriya had returned to class, practically sleepwalking, bandages and all, he almost dragged the boy to Nizu right then and demanded something be done. Of course, he'd brought the situation to the principal's attention on the first day of classes, but the timeline needed to be accelerated. A child being forced to endure such horrible treatment every day? How could this happen at a school full of heroes? And to think he could have prevented it? No, this was not the time nor place for useless pity. The past, no matter how unfortunate, was the past, and nothing could be done to change it now. The present, on the other hand, reaching the door to Nizu's office, Shoyuta braced himself. He was not sure what to expect. Surely the principal would recognize the gravity of the situation, but the lack of progress in the past month was frustrating to say the least. He entered the room. Aizawa, come sit. The mouse gestured to the leather seat across from his desk, before continuing. So, you're here about Midoriya Izuku, the Hero Commission trainee, correct? Yes. His voice was low. I have several concerns about the commission's treatment of the boy. Nizu tapped the desk. That is out of our jurisdiction, you know. As teachers, the well-being of our students is well within our jurisdiction. Shoyuta said sharply. Forgive me, he took out a pen and paper. I was just observing your rationality regarding the case. Shoyuta glared. My rationality should be the least of your concerns. All right. He waved his paw dismissively. Please continue with your findings. First off, his actions at USJ. He went above and beyond what was expected of a first-year student and saved my life, as well as the lives of a number of his classmates. Yet, in doing so showed little to no regard for his own personal well-being and lost control of his quirk, despite his advanced skill level and battle experience. He hesitated, choosing his next words carefully. Even with the most volatile quirks, such instability after so many years of training is highly unlikely, at least without some intentional impairment. Nizu raised his eyebrows. What are you implying? Look, I don't know what their regimen involves, but the bruises and scarring on his neck and wrists, reminiscent of restraints, the excessive exhaustion, it's abusive and cannot be inflicted with anything resembling pure intentions. Shoyuta stopped himself, making an effort to consciously modulate his pitch. The only reason the commission's actions are treated as legal is because they think they're above the law. I see. Nizu had jotted down a few notes, but set his pen down as he looked at him. It'd do well to remember no one being, or organization for that matter, is truly above being brought to justice. And yet here we are. Though, Shoyuta reasoned that sentiment was a good sign. The mouse continued, of course, I dislike the Hero Commission. Their unsavory tactics have been on my radar for quite some time now, but there's never been a reason for any interference on my part. I figured, surely it should not fall to an animal to right humanity's wrongs. However, now that one of my students is involved, this is another matter entirely. He gazed out of the window of his office into the courtyard. Shoyuta knew it would be unwise to cut in, the mounting sense of urgency he felt, had been feeling for months, would do him no service here, and besides, Nizu was nothing if not long-winded. "I am glad you brought this to my attention. I, of course, communicated with commission officers upon Midoriya's enrollment and thus know a bit about his current circumstances. Unfortunately, you are correct in the sense that any actions on Yue's part will undoubtedly involve legal loopholes. As far as I can tell, this will not be an easy process. But I'll need to call in several favors." Nizu's voice trailed off into a series of quiet, yet intense mutterings as he began jotting down notes. After a few minutes and several pages of paper, Shoyuta finally saw it fit to interrupt. "What is the timeline?" The scratching of writing slowed to a halt, as Nizu tore his eyes away from the page. "That is the question, isn't it?" "Well, if it is." Before Shoyuta could express any sort of discontent at the playful tone of that response, the principal exhaled deeply. "I don't know." He frowned. "The Hero Development Program is highly classified. I don't know much more about it than the name itself. Certainly, Midoriya can be taken out of it, of that I have no doubt, but whether it's a month from now or a year, I can't say. There must be something to do in the meantime." His words grew louder and louder, but Shoyuta could not be bothered at this point, updating the regulations for training on school days, establishing limits on the number of hours a day or a week. Anything is better than the way it is now. "I will see what I can do," Nizu cut in, "though I doubt any contractual agreements will be altered so close to the sports festival. That's bureaucratic nonsense." He snapped. The mouse sighed. "Yes, but what does that change? It's true regardless." The words hung in the air, interrupted by the distant ringing of the bell signifying the end of fourth period. Had that much time passed already? "You have a class to get to now, don't you, Aizawa?" "Yes." He stood up to leave. "I want to be kept in the loop on this. I wouldn't have it any other way." The sounds of pencil on paper resumed, and just as the door closed shut, Shoyuta could have sworn he heard Nizu mutter, "Aizawa and Toshinori both bringing this to my attention." Toshinori? Wasn't that All Might's first name? Interesting. The sports festival was fast approaching, and Shinso Hitoshi was fed up. His classmates hardly seemed to care, which was absurd. Who could be satisfied with being a general studies student at UA? Just the nature of the position was almost shameful. His entire life, everyone had always said he'd never make it as a hero, and who would have faith in the foster kid with a villainous quirk, but the rejection letter from the hero course had cut deeper than expected. It was discouraging beyond belief. Still, Hitoshi couldn't just sit back and let everyone be right about him. No, all the years of hurt and pain had made him stronger, and he was going to prove it. Hell, he'd make sure all those people who doubted him realized just how wrong they had been. Maybe that's why he was standing outside the first hero studies classroom. Honestly, this decision was questionable at best, but Hitoshi didn't care. He wanted to make waves at the sports festival. What better way than to rile up the competition? The bell rang. He dashed out of class a few minutes early, and the door swung open. Finally. "So this is the famous Class 1A? You don't look all that special." Hitoshi made an effort to stand straight, sneering at the students as they exited into the hallway. "You know, general studies students can be transferred to the hero courses based on performance at the sport festival." He smirked. "I've heard the reverse is also true." He made eye contact with some dark-haired boy with glasses, whose surprise at his declaration was quickly morphing towards annoyance. Before Hitoshi could bait him any further, which looked like it would have been quite entertaining, he saw that kid everyone was talking about. Midoriya, wasn't it? His look was pretty distinct. Apparently he'd personally fought a bunch of villains at the USJ incident, or maybe the strongest one. Hitoshi wasn't sure of the details, but he was sure Midoriya pissed him off. Probably thought he was better than him, just because he'd already had the chance to show off his skills. "Hey, Midoriya." Hitoshi failed to get his attention, but some blonde kid walking next to him turned around and glared. "What? You're not going to turn around and face me yourself?" He took a breath to steady himself. "Need one of your lackeys to do it for you? I didn't think future heroes were supposed to be so pathetic." "But what the Fuck did you just say?" The blonde kid was practically charging towards him, his hands dragging behind him as if rearing up for a punch. Maybe he had gone a little too far. It was too late to backtrack now. He braced himself for impact. Huh. Everything stopped as Midoriya turned around in apparent confusion. Kaken, what's going on? He stifled a yawn. The blonde appeared to make an attempt at swallowing his rage before answering, and there was a moment of quiet as Midoriya processed the murderous look on his face, his sleepy expression morphing into one of displeasure. When he spoke, his voice was cold, and his gaze might as well have been from 20 stories up. Were you saying something? All oxygen had taken the opportunity to flee his lungs. Something about Midoriya's demeanor. The power radiating off of him, it was frightening. Hitoshi felt as though he could be crushed with a single thought. He was too rattled to even ask why he'd called the other boy Kaken. He wasn't. The blonde hissed, making his way back to Midoriya. If you say so. The pair left, and Hitoshi stood, dumbfounded in the hallway as the other students filtered out. You should watch yourself. He whipped his head to face. Endeavor's kid? What? Traces of annoyance seeped back into his voice. What's it to you? Your behavior pisses me off. The boy said flatly, know when you're out of league. Hitoshi, still rattled from the previous exchange, just glared as he walked away. Of course a pro hero's son would be so pretentious. But, deep down, a sinking feeling told him he was right. At least about Midoriya. He tried his best to ignore it. Whatever, there was nothing to do now but wait. To be honest, Katsuki had expected to be a lot more excited. The mid-morning sun shone brightly onto the massive stadium, as the idle chatter of thousands of spectators compounded into a dull roar. After so many years of watching the sports festival, he was finally here, standing on the stage about to give the first-year address, but everything was off. Scanning the faces of his classmates, he zeroed in on Deku, who was standing alone, obviously, and wearing a blank look on his face. He'd barely spoken a word all morning. There was absolutely no reason to be worried about him. He'd been training for literal years, but since the USJ incident, or whatever the hell had happened afterwards, he'd been increasingly distant. Katsuki knew things were wrong, but he didn't know if they were actively getting worse or not, and he didn't know why. Fuck, it was all so frustrating. Midnight, who was standing beside him, smiled and motioned for him to speak. He swallowed and began, I'm looking forward to the competition today. Deku wasn't even watching. I wish everyone the best of luck. Whose idea was this dumb speech anyway? Katsuki quickly stepped off the podium, and Kirishima immediately approached him. Nice address. He grinned, short and to the point. His cheeks reddened, which would have been concerning under normal circumstances, but before he could respond, the gates to the first challenge, which Midnight had previously announced was an obstacle course, opened on the wall in front of them. Everyone, Deku included, started making their way to the starting line. He'd hoped to at least briefly talk with him before the event, but instead he ended up rushing with Kirishima to secure an optimal starting position. The two joined the rest of Class 1A who'd managed to cram their way to the front. Midnight fired the starting piston and everyone was off. Katsuki's palms flashed with heat as he used his explosions to propel himself forward. Much to his annoyance, Icy Hot was neck and neck moments later, complete with a trail of ice emanating behind him. Before he could tell him to piss off, there was a bright flash of green light and a gust of heat, as Deku passed right above both of them. This again, Icy Hot muttered, but before he got the chance to give any further commentary, the path darkened. A group of large metal zero-pointer robots from the entrance exam materialized about 50 feet down, but honestly there were more of a nuisance at this point. Deku careened into one of them, and subsequently launched off it, all the while sending fissures throughout its entire body and toppling it to the right of the main path. Katsuki began gathering sweat in one palm, while continuously firing off explosions with the other so as to maintain momentum. He took out a few robots in a fiery blast, and by the sound of it Icy Hot froze the entire section of track over, which prevented the robots from crashing down on other students, but also got a whole slew of them stuck. Serves them right for being slow. As the race progressed, he managed to pull in front of Icy Hot, but Deku remained frustratingly ahead, zooming past obstacles at an impressive pace. Watching him, it felt like Katsuki was surrounded by molasses, even though his limbs burned and his lungs ached from the physical stress. He might as well have been moving in place. The gap, slowly but surely, only grew larger and larger. How could this be? How could he ever help someone he trailed so far behind? Finally, Katsuki caught sight of the finish line, though Deku had completed the course moments before. With a final blast, he launched himself to the end, crossing a few seconds before Icy Hot. At least he beat that asshole. Deku. He walked over to him quickly, hardly even taking a moment to catch his breath. Congratulations? Deku nodded. His face was expressionless, and any hints of exhaustion were fleeting at best, from the race itself at least. Lately, extreme fatigue was his default for any activity that wasn't training. I wasn't expecting another obstacle course. Huh. Katsuki frowned. That's what the recommendations exam was as well. He watched the now steady stream of students passing across the finish line. Oh, that explained Icy Hot's commented at the start. Congratulations. Present Mick's voice boomed over the speaker system. Starting in first place, we have Midoriya Izuku. In second, Bakugo Katsuki. In third, Todoroki Shoto. He continued, to both Katsuki's and the audience's dismay, listing all 42 top contestants. Interestingly, Kirishima had placed ninth, which was a real testament to his stamina as his quirk didn't really lend itself to speed. Finally, it was time for the second event to begin. The next event is a cavalry battle. Midnight smiled widely. Each of you continuing has been assigned a point value based on your ranking in the last event. You'll form groups of 2 to 4 and aim to steal the headbands of opposing teams. She went on to keep talking about the intricacies of the event, but Katsuki wasn't really listening. Icy Hot had turned towards Deku and looked like he was about to approach him. No fucking way. He glared in his direction and was met with a cold stare as the asshole stepped towards him. Ponytail quickly pulled him aside before the situation escalated. Whatever. Suddenly, Kirishima popped up to his right. Hey, can I join your guys' team? I can help form a strong base. With my hardening I'll be able to withstand either of your attacks. Katsuki glanced over at Deku, who was just sort of staring into the crowd. Sure. No one else seemed to want to team up, which made sense as the group had a fairly large target on their backs with the 10 million points and all. But he didn't want those losers anyway, and Deku could levitate, so the lack of a fourth member didn't matter as much. Which of you is going to be the rider? Kirishima asked, looking back and forth between them. Deku is? Katsuki clarified. The white-haired boy, at the mention of his name, turned to face the other two. It makes the most sense. Katsuki sighed, focusing his attention on Deku. He'd half expected the boy to protest, but he hardly seemed to be paying any attention. His arms hung stiffly at his sides, and his gaze was so distant, so tired. With your telekinesis, I'll still be open to fight anyway. The words practically spilled out of his mouth. That's a good point. Kirishima pumped his fist in the air. We're going to make a great team. Deku just looked back out at the stands, his expression quickly hardening. In preparation for the event, he guessed. Katsuki wondered what was on his mind, and whether that cold stare was worse than the previous exhausted one. A gnawing sense of dread about the boy's situation continued to eat away at him. Shoto was distracted. Third place? That was not enough. His father was in the stands somewhere. He was no doubt furious and disappointed, but things had been different lately. Maybe it was because he'd been slightly injured, but things at home had been a little different after USJ. Training sessions were shorter, more focused on strategy than power. Part of that was surely just now that he was at U, there was less of a need for additional practice, but the look on his father's face picking him up from the hospital. A mixture of relief and regret. Shoto didn't think about it much. His mother's absence was far more apparent in his day-to-day life, but his father had lost a son before. The close call could have put things into perspective? At least a little. That reminded him. Midoriya was looking straight at him when he spoke, and even though he tried to ignore his words, it just couldn't be a coincidence, could it? Students. Midnight's voice called out over the speaker system, interrupting his thoughts. The battle begins in less than a minute. Shoto looked out at the team he'd assembled, Momo, Ida, and Kaminari. He was obviously going to be the rider, and the combination of versatility, speed, and sheer power the bunch possessed practically ensured success, not that he was all too worried about advancing in the competition. He'd wanted to ask Midoriya, of course, but Bakugo had been getting on his last nerves and it just wasn't worth the trouble. Momo nudged him. Let's get ready to start, right? He nodded and the four got into position. Ready, go. Teams descended into the arena, and Shoto's team was able to snag ribbons off of some of the weaker ones with ease. This is the revenge of Class 1B. Some blonde kid appeared out of nowhere, lunging for one of the headbands around his neck. Luckily, Momo shot a stream of babushka dolls clocking the boy right in the chin, long enough to distract him as Ida propelled the team in the opposite direction. Nice one, Yaozu. Kaminari exclaimed once they were a safe distance away, and Shoto nodded in agreement. As the event went on, his eyes were repeatedly drawn to Midoriya's team. Despite only consisting of 3 members, the group was having no difficulties keeping others at bay, and with Bakugo and Kirishima launching initial attacks, throwing opponents off their rhythm, Midoriya was able to telekinetically pull their headbands. Wow, it was almost unfair. There was only a minute left now, and they most definitely had enough to advance to the next level, but Shoto was not satisfied. He sized up Midoriya's team for a final time, and this time Midoriya's eyes locked with his, and to his lower left, Bakugo smirked. Finally, are you sure about this? Momo asked quickly as the team, having picked up on the growing standoff, prepared to charge. Yes. He frowned in annoyance. I came here to win. With a resounding boom from Ida's recipro burst, the gap between the teams was closing fast, almost too fast. Small, building explosions popped off of Bakugo's palms, and Shoto grabbed the headbands around his neck. Damn it, he'd hoped it would have taken longer for the quirk to activate. A full-out counterattack would leave him vulnerable to Midoriya's telekinesis. A one-handed ice sheet would have to do. He rapidly cooled down his right side, but just as the first few frozen crystals formed in his wake, Shoto could tell it wouldn't be enough to bear the full brunt of Bakugo's blast. At this speed, no one else was in position to react offensively, and he begrudgingly let go of the headbands so as to dedicate a full body movement to a massive wall of ice. For a second it was quiet. Then, there were repetitive muffled booms, and within moments cracks radiated throughout the frozen barrier. That's really all you got? Bakugo's voice was loud as the team cratered through the remnants of the structure, Midoriya cloaked in a cloud of emerald flames. Maybe it was the urgency of the situation, the lack of time for another ice attack, but he felt a white-hot panic radiating through his bones. Before Shoto could resist, his left side was ablaze. Bakugo and Kirishima's eyes widened at the display, the two both faltering in their charge. Midoriya exhibited no such reluctance, the flames surrounding him only growing stronger as the air between the two boys exponentially increased in temperature. It all happened so fast. His left hand was on the headbands, preparing for a telekinetic attack. His flames flashed white, then green, before being instantaneously dissipated in a scorching wave of heat. Shoto's jaw went slack as he stared at Midoriya, frozen in shock. What the hell was that? Midoriya's face was relaxed, his eyes slightly squinted in concentration as he continued to gain distance. He was only around 10 feet away. Shoto couldn't move. Time. Midnight called. Wow. What an event! The tension broke in an instant. Shifting the direction of his velocity to a downward angle, Midoriya landed and walked back to his team. I didn't know he could do that, Ida said slowly, still reeling from the display as Shoto hopped down. Are you all right? Momo glanced towards him, her brow knit with concern. He didn't respond, opting instead to look at his bare left hand. It took a few moments before Shoto could muster little flames to dance around in palm. Oh, his father would most certainly not be pleased. But more importantly, the lack of hesitation. Even though Midoriya had never seen him use his fire before, he knew exactly what to do. The arm movement, the precision, it was unmistakably well rehearsed. Of course, there was an explanation that made everything make sense. It was time for a talk. Katsuki should absolutely not be eavesdropping on this conversation. He knew that. Yet here he was, his back pressed against the fresh concrete lining the walls of the stadium's hallways, preparing to listen in on whatever nonsense Icy Hot was going to ramble on about. His weird obsession with Deku was seriously pissing him off at this point, and if this discussion finally explained it, so be it. Icy Hot, naturally, was the first one to speak. Made me use my fire. Bullshit. No one made him do anything. I swore I wouldn't use that power in battle. I refused to bend to my father's will, to give him the satisfaction of watching me succeed with his quirk like some puppet. Continuing, Icy Hot's voice was slowly growing louder. You had never seen me use my flames before, but you reacted so quickly, almost like muscle memory. Like you'd trained with someone who has a fire quirk? Deku remained silent. I told myself I wouldn't ask you about this. It was such a terrible day, but he hesitated. You called me to ya? There was another short pause. Did you train with my brother? Katsuki's stomach dropped. No way, no fucking way. A wave of nausea washed over him. Obviously Deku had known this whole time, and he'd never said anything? Not to him? Yes. His voice was flat, and he did not elaborate. At the Hero Commission? Icy Hot asked in bewilderment. He couldn't see, but assumed Deku nodded. The question seemed almost nonsensical for a moment, but Katsuki was only growing more confused and horrified each second. Why was Deku the one crying out for him in his nightmares, and Icy Hot didn't even know where he died? I hardly remember him. Were you too close? Icy Hot's voice was hushed now, almost a whisper. Is that why you just looked alike at that moment, I guess? Deku interrupted. There wasn't any more to it. Liar. But he continued, I'm sorry, I have to go prepare for my match. He stepped towards the main hallway, and Katsuki ducked silently into a janitor's closet. Waiting until after the two pairs of footsteps traveled far enough away before taking a deep breath of air, Katsuki tried in vain to make sense of what the hell just happened. His heart was practically pounding out of his chest. There was no reason for Deku to lie. Why would he call the boy his friend and hide such a crucial detail? And the faux nonchalant attitude towards the entire situation. Obviously Deku didn't have to explain everything right then, but to be so dismissive? Asking him about it would be difficult. As he walked slowly back to the locker rooms, he cringed just thinking of a possible line of questioning. Hey, why didn't you tell Todoroki that you watched his estranged brother die violently? Just thinking about Todoroki's part in all of this, Katsuki was overcome by a mixture of pity and confusion. Why would a son of Endeavor end up in a place like the Commission anyway? Surely the hero had enough political sway to not let his son be whisked to some government agency. No, his eyes widened as the horror dawned slowly. Tuya must have been sent on purpose. Just what sort of father would do that? Unquestionably, he was more concerned about Deku, and Todoroki had seemed more angry at Endeavor than afraid, but you never really know what's happening behind closed doors. Katsuki learned that lesson a long time ago.